It happened in less than 5 seconds. One moment, the crowd at Denver International was shuffling toward gate C-32, voices blending into the usual airport hum. The next, Kaiser, an aging but razor-sharp German Shepherd canine, snapped his head toward a family of 4. His posture changed instantly, muscles coiled, ears forward, eyes locked. To anyone else, it might have looked like a dog distracted by a stranger. But Daniel Ross, his handler, had seen that stance before. It was the same look Kaiser wore in Afghanistan, seconds before uncovering a hidden weapons cache. The family looked ordinary, too ordinary. The father laughed at something on his phone. The mother adjusted her scarf. The kids clutched small backpacks. But Kaiser didn't break eye contact. Something about them wasn't right, and Daniel's gut told him this was no coincidence. What happened next would unravel a network so well hidden it spanned 3 states, and it all began with the silent warning from a dog who'd spent his life protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The concourse at Denver International had its own kind of heartbeat that morning, a steady, rhythmic pulse made of footsteps on polished tile, the hum of distant escalators, and the occasional burst of laughter from a traveler trying to make light of an early flight. Above it all, the scent of fresh coffee drifted from a kiosk near the security checkpoint, mingling with the sharper tang of disinfectant that the overnight crew had sprayed just hours before. Lieutenant Daniel Carter walked that concourse as he had hundreds of times before, his uniform pressed and boots clean, the black nylon leash in his hand slack but never loose. At the other end of it was Kaiser, a German shepherd with a sable coat and the kind of self-possession that drew second glances from people who knew working dogs. Kaiser didn't strain against the lead, didn't get distracted by the rolling suitcases or the crinkle of sandwich wrappers. His gait matched Daniel's as if they'd been practicing for years, and in truth they had. The two of them had been partners for 3 years, their communication often reduced to the smallest gestures, a tilt of Daniel's head, a flick of his fingers, a shift in his breathing, that Kaiser seemed to understand without hesitation. It wasn't just training, though training had been rigorous. It was trust. Trust built in quiet moments like these, on routine patrols where nothing much happened, but each step, each glance, Control, this is K9 Unit 4, unattended item at B12 requesting verification. The voice on the other end was calm, routine.
Copy that, Unit 4. Sending an attendant to check.
A few moments later, a harried young man jogged over, boarding pass in hand, muttering apologies. Apparently, he'd just stepped away to buy water. Daniel gave a polite nod and a word of reminder, then they moved on. It was nothing, at least today. But Daniel glanced down at Kaiser and caught that steady, unblinking gaze that seemed to say, "I noticed first." And maybe that was the truth. By the time they neared the middle of Concourse B, the flow of travelers had thickened. Families clustered near flight monitors. Business people walked fast with phones pressed to their ears. A young couple sat close together sharing earbuds. Over the years, Daniel had learned that airports were strange crossroads, moments of departure and arrival layered together. People said goodbye with tears and hello with laughter. In between, everyone shared the same space, breathing the same recycled air, unaware of the quiet, constant watch of airport security. Kaiser was part of that watch, and Daniel knew that the dog's instincts often picked up what the human eye missed. He'd seen it before, the microsecond hesitation in a smuggler's step, the scent trace of narcotics hidden behind perfume and plastic. Kaiser noticed, even if no one else did. They slowed near a window where the morning sun poured in, catching the edges of metal chairs and casting long shadows across the floor. Daniel let Kaiser take a moment to sniff at the air vents, a habit the dog had developed to catalog scents from a distance. Travelers passed them without a second glance. It was, Daniel thought, the sort of morning that could pass without incident. But he also knew, from a dozen unexpected calls in his career, that quiet could break without warning, and sometimes it was the smallest change, the faintest sound, that signaled the shift. Kaiser's ears twitched once, then settled. He gave a soft, almost imperceptible chuff, not alarm, just acknowledgement. Daniel smiled faintly, reached down and brushed his hand across the shepherd's shoulder in a gesture that said, "I hear you." Neither of them knew it yet, but just a few gates away, the morning was a bit way it did when the day behaved itself. Around them, the airport sang its ordinary song, a barista calling out a name, the soft clatter of plastic lids, wheels thumping seams in the floor, a flight attendant's laugh carried thin across the concourse. At B-17, the crowd was a tapestry. A grandmother in a navy cardigan stood with fingers laced around the handle of a floral suitcase, her mouth making silent counts as she checked her boarding pass again. Gate, group, seat. A man in a suit, tie loosened, pinched his phone between shoulder and ear as he typed a text with both thumbs, talking revenue targets in a voice polished enough to sell weather. Two kids in matching dinosaur shirts argued about whether the tail should face up or down on the neck pillow, their father kneeling to referee with the weary patience of a man who'd done 3 trips in 2 months. A college couple shared a bag of orange slices, his sweatshirt bunched at the elbows, her nails the color of a summer tomato. They watched the runway like it might tell them a secret about the future if they stared long enough. Tourists in park-bright colors compared maps and apps. A woman with a camera the size of a cantaloupe adjusted her lens to catch the way a jet's fuselage flashed when the sun struck it just right. A man with a cowboy hat and earbuds tapped a boot heel to music only he could hear. A pair of monks in saffron robes sat very still, hands folded, faces open to the light. Everywhere, tiny human rituals, coffee sips, zipper tugs, the careful stash of a passport in a zippered jacket, took place with the quiet concentration of prayer. Daniel had always liked this part, the before of things. Airports were museums of departures, galleries of hope and habit. He took it in like a field medic checking a pulse, watching for the stutter that meant trouble. Calm could be a disguise, so could kindness. He'd learned that the hard way. "Easy," he murmured, palm brushing Kaiser's shoulder, a touch so light most people wouldn't have felt it. Kaiser's ear twitched back, just for him, and then forward again, reading the air. The loudspeaker crackled with a pre-boarding announcement. A few people stood too early, hovering between readiness and impatience. The gate agent, gray bob, glasses on a cheerful chain, worked her line with the deftness of a baker sliding loaves into an oven, one after another. Anchor you could hold between your fingers until the world settled again. This was the surface of things. It glittered, it breathed, it moved like good water. And under it, he knew, currents ran that could knock a person off their feet. He'd once watched a man with the soft hands of an accountant park himself beside a trash can with a carry-on that weighed too little for its shape. Nothing in the man's manner called attention. He smiled at a toddler who stared too long at his shoelaces, thanked the janitor for sweeping near his feet. Kaiser had given the lightest of alerts, more a question than a certainty, and Daniel had followed that question until it turned into metal wrapped in towels, not a bomb, not that day, but parts and plans and notes in a language someone thought would be sure cover. Another time he'd seen a teacher, real, honest, with chalk dust ground into the seams of her purse, carry painkillers prescribed to someone who wasn't her, tucked beside carefully folded permission slips. Not a trafficker, not a violent person, just someone who had once broken her back trying to do right by the kids in her charge, now trapped in a quiet private storm. He'd walked her to a clinic rather than a cell. The law had room for that. The point was less about guilt than about how ordinary the dangerous could look, and how danger didn't always come dressed as a villain. Kaiser's shoulder brushed his thigh, a reminder and a reassurance. The dog did not philosophize. He mapped the world with nose and nerve, sorting scent into meaning. Jet fuel, lemon cleaner, the cold metal tang of the railings, wool and shampoo and cinnamon gum, the faint peppered note of a stranger's fear wafting from the back of a throat. To Kaiser, the story lived in those threads. To Daniel, the dog's stillness was its own vocabulary. He took a slow breath, let the air flood his lungs, and studied the gate like a puzzle. The business traveler with the loosened tie watched his own reflection in the glass as he talked, a tell Daniel had learned to distrust. The grandmother checked her pass a 4th time and, satisfied, retied the ribbon on her bag with small, capable fingers. The monks didn't move at all. Ordinary, ordinary, ordinary. A janitor pushed a yellow cart by, wheels squeaking a beat out of sync with the overhead music. He lifted the caution sign with the solemnity of bigger piece. "Don't wait for it to turn red. It's got your favorite color on today." He'd laughed then, green as spring, but the line stuck like truth tends to, simple and sharp. He'd repeated it to rookies over the years, offering the smaller half of whatever he was eating, never sure if the snack or the sentence landed better. Maybe both. At B17, a family of 5 arranged themselves by size for a photo. Father crouched low, mother framing them with her phone, the littlest boy refusing to smile until his sister tapped his nose. The picture came out anyway, joy imperfect and therefore honest. Daniel felt something unknot in his chest at the sight. People were, at their core, trying. That, more than anything, was why he did this work, to protect the small acts of everyday courage, getting on a plane though your hands shook, boarding after saying a hard goodbye, braiding hair because the world felt big. Kaiser stopped. Not a freeze yet, but the kind of pause that pulls the mind taut. His head turned a few degrees to the left, nostrils shaping the air with delicate, almost ceremonial care. Daniel followed the line of the dog's gaze as it drifted past the gate stanchions, across a cluster of rolling backpacks, to a moving pocket in the crowd. Nothing obvious. A man's navy windbreaker, a floral scarf catching the sun like a flag of spring. 2 small hands swallowed inside adult palms, the shape of a family, as ordinary as any on the concourse. Daniel let his eyes pass over them the way a fisherman's net skims the surface. No tug, no catch, then back again, slower. He took a step without meaning to, drawn by something he couldn't yet name. Kaiser mirrored him, weight shifting forward, tail lowering a notch as if to trim the air for silence. Daniel felt his own breath quiet to match. This was the seam between routine and whatever came next, the place where training crowded close to instinct and asked which one should lead. Beyond the glass, a jet lifted on a roar that rattled the teeth of the windows. Inside, the gate agent called for pre-boarding, her voice bright as a bell. People stood, the way they do, too soon, too eager. Daniel moved with them as if he were part of the tide, not against it. Kaiser's eyes never left the pocket of the crowd where the windbreaker, the scarf, and the 2 small hands threaded through. An old memory flickered, another gate, swelled and contracted as lines formed and broke. A child cried because his stuffed animal wouldn't fit in the seat back pocket he didn't have yet, and his mother promised magic in a whisper. A pilot tipped 2 fingers to his hat as he passed. The man in the loosened tie finally hung up, exhaled and blinked at nothing. The world kept doing what it does, moving, folding, forgiving small mistakes. Kaiser's pause lengthened into stillness, the disciplined kind learned in a dozen drills and 100 days on duty. Daniel felt the change like a thread pulled tight across his ribs. He softened his knees, let his hand slide a fraction down the leash, breathing through a patience he wore like second skin. The couple shifted, only a step, and the children with them became clearer in the wash of light. 1 ponytail, 1 too big jacket, the scarf tossed just so, hiding 1 shoulder. Nothing wrong with the human eye, perhaps, but to Kaiser the air told a different story. Daniel didn't know the words yet. He was about to. The shepherd lifted his head a hair, eyes sharpening, the soft hum of the concourse falling away in Daniel's awareness, until there was only the line between his partner's gaze and that small moving knot of people. The morning, which had felt like a long, easy inhale, reached its limit, and somewhere inside Kaiser, the exhale gathered. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. Kaiser's stride shortened, then stopped entirely, as clean and sudden as a candlepin set upright on polished wood. His ears pricked, tall and narrow as spires, and his body aligned along an invisible line that ran straight through gate B17 to a moving knot of 4. A man in a navy windbreaker, a woman in a floral scarf, and two small children threaded between them like beads on a cord. Daniel felt it first as absence, the airport's soft music dimming, the clatter of suitcase wheels receding, as if someone had turned down the volume on a life he'd been listening to without realizing. It was the oldest feeling he knew on this job, the gentle collapse of ordinary. He didn't look around for the cause because the cause was already telling him where to look. He just followed the line of Kaiser's gaze and let the world rearrange itself to fit the dog's attention. From 20 feet, his tail lowered, not tucked, not tense, just settled in the way of a dog who switched off everything he doesn't need. Daniel's hand found the familiar knurled edge of the leash clip and, without looking, slid down an inch, placing his touch where Kaiser would feel it. A small, private question moved down the leather. The dog's left ear tipped back, just enough to say, "I know you're with me." Then forward again. The couple shifted toward the pre-boarding line in the way people do when they are eager to be done with the waiting part. The girl's ponytail brushed the woman's sleeve. The boy stared hard at the floor as if there were words down there only he could read. The scarf lifted, fell, and settled over a shoulder like a curtain closing. Something thin and bright unspooled inside Daniel, a wire drawn taut from his sternum to his shoulder blades. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was attention with a heartbeat. He felt the air go cool against the back of his neck. He reminded himself, as he always did at the start of this particular kind of moment, that the work was to stay with the quiet and let it tell you what it knew. "Easy," he said, and the word was more for him than for the dog. Kaiser's chest expanded once, held, released. Then he gave it, the sound that would divide the morning into before and after. The bark cracked the concourse cleanly, sharp and resonant as a struck bell. It wasn't the rolling thunder of a challenge, not the ragged sound of a dog upset by noise. It was a single, precise note, purpose shaped into sound. Heads turned as if by shared agreement. A coffee cup stopped halfway to someone's mouth. The gate agent's hand froze over a boarding pass. Even the overhead speaker seemed to reconsider its next sentence. The bark hung in the light for the space of one heartbeat, then found its echo in the attention of 100 strangers. Kaiser didn't repeat it immediately. He stood with all four paws placed squarely on the carpet seam and looked down the line of that invisible thread again, measuring. His body language said what Daniel had learned to read as clearly as text. This, here. Daniel's internal world shifted in a way he recognized and trusted, like a camera lens clicking from a wide, generous depth of field to a narrow, deliberate focus. The room sharpened, periphery dimmed. He felt his own breathing drop low, checking look, and Daniel let the smallest nod travel down to him, as much motion as a blade of grass gives to wind. "We're together. Keep reading." The dog made no sound. He didn't need to. The bond between them had a vocabulary of ritual. Breath, posture, weight shifted half a foot forward. You could stand inside that language and feel safe, even when the world just beyond it wasn't. He took in the radius around the couple the way he'd been trained. Not just the four of them, but the air they moved through, the bags that nudged their knees, the eyes of the people nearest them. To the left, a road warrior type with a scuffed briefcase watched Kaiser with the affectionate attention of someone who'd had a dog once and missed him. To the right, a teenager in a hoodie filmed casually, phone angled like a secret. Behind, the grandmother from earlier pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, "Oh my," in a way that wasn't alarmed so much as surprised. Kaiser gave a second bark, shorter, closer to the ground, almost a stamped punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. The couple's heads turned in the same beat, the man to track the source, the woman to find a path through. The scarf's colors flashed again when she pivoted. The boy's jacket sleeve slid back an inch as his arm lifted, and Daniel's eyes, which had learned their patient arithmetic, catalogued the faintest blush of a red line just above the wrist bone, the way an elastic leaves a memory on skin. He didn't move yet. This job, done well, rarely rewarded haste. A decisive action would be coming. He could feel it gathering weight like a thunderhead. But first, the quiet had a little more to say. He let his stance widen half an inch and softened his shoulders. You learn how to look like comfort in a uniform, how to let strangers borrow your steadiness for a second so they don't startle and set the whole flock running. He kept his voice in the friendly register he'd used with nervous travelers 1,000 times. "Morning, folks," he called, not yet closing the distance. "How are you doing today?" The man's smile came fast, bright, and practiced. The woman's did not arrive until a heartbeat after, as if it had to be fetched from another room. The girl lifted her eyes and dropped them just as quickly, the way a small bird flutters to a fence post and is gone. Kaiser stayed still. The stillness, Daniel knew, was work. It took more discipline than movement. Hush that follows a hymn. A tension had gathered here. It wouldn't fully disperse again until the story finished telling itself. On the other side of the windows, a jet rolled slow and sure toward the runway, its shadow lengthening across tarmac. Inside, Daniel let his next breath be slower than the one before. He could feel the work in front of him, a conversation to start, a space to hold, a path to shape so no one had to run. He checked the small things, the radio warm against his shoulder, the strip of leather solid in his grip, the dog beside him anchored like a stone in a stream. He thought, briefly and with a kind of gratitude, of all the mornings that had looked exactly like this one and ended with nothing more remarkable than paperwork and a late lunch. He thought, too, of the other mornings, the ones that started in this same calm light and then tipped, gently at first and then all at once. The difference between those days often came down to whether a handler remembered what the dog knew. Kaiser's eyes flicked once more to Daniel, not asking, just confirming the shape of the next minute. Daniel answered with the smallest shift of weight and a word that was almost breath. "Together." The dog's chest rose. The couple took another step toward the rope line. The girl's sneaker scuffed the carpet, a quiet little scrape. And then, as if to etch a line in the air that none of them could step over and pretend not to have seen, Kaiser sent one more bark into the morning, clear, precise, and impossibly alive. Heads turned, shoulders paused mid-shrug. Across the gate, a child with a stuffed giraffe lifted it like a question mark. The moment had chosen its trajectory. Routine had let go. Daniel felt the shift finish settling inside him, the part of the job that was both muscle memory and prayer, and he stepped forward into it, the shepherd at his knee, the crowd holding its breath as if the next sentence might matter in a way the ordinary ones didn't. It would. The second bark was still rippling through the air when Daniel stepped forward, letting the crowd's slow tide carry him until he stood within speaking distance of the four. Up close, the picture sharpened. The man in the navy windbreaker had the clean, standard-issue look of someone who bought his clothes by column. S, M, L. No fuss, no pattern, zipper pulled at most, held tight to the man, his jacket a shade too big in the shoulder, cuffs grazing the knuckles. His shoes were new, the soles too clean for kids who ran. It was a family written in simple strokes. It would have been easy to accept the sentence as it stood. "Morning," Daniel said, voice pitched for calm. "Officer Carter, Airport Police." He let the badge at his chest do the heavy part of the talking. "This is Kaiser. He's trained to work these gates." The man's smile bloomed promptly, practiced ease in the corners. "Sure, of course." His eyes slid to Kaiser and back again, measuring the dog and the man in one pass. "We're just pre-boarding." The woman smiled too, a beat behind, as if her mouth had to be convinced. "We're headed home," she added, the scarf shifting when she lifted her shoulder. Daniel nodded, letting the words drift by without taking hold. He didn't step closer. Distance can be a kindness and a tool. He raised 2 fingers, low by his thigh. "Kaiser, heel." The shepherd didn't move. Ears like arrows, eyes welded to the fore, feet planted with the quiet authority of a cornerstone. The leash lay in a clean line from Daniel's hand to the clip, leather cool and familiar under his fingers. He felt the knot moving as clearly as he would have felt a pull. It said, "Here is the dot on the map. Don't blink." "Good boy," Daniel murmured, the words soft as a thumb on a worrystone. He'd learned long ago that sometimes praise means keep doing exactly this. The gate's ambient life flowed around them. Boarding calls, the polite shuffle of people organizing themselves into groups, the squeak of a cartwheel surrendering to its fate. A toddler somewhere behind them laughed, and then immediately apologized for laughing, as toddlers do. The world, stubborn, continued its routine. "Big day for the kids," Daniel said lightly. "Where's home for you?" "Nashville," the man answered before the woman could, syllables trimmed crisp. "Quick trip to see family in Colorado Springs." The woman nodded, quick and earnest. "It was last minute. We packed in a hurry." Daniel let his eyes settle on the tote bag riding the woman's far shoulder. It was the kind of bag that suggested weekends and picnics. Canvas, striped, handsome. Boy's jacket, too, had the borrowed look. Sleeves half swallowed, shoulders square where a 4-year-old's would slope. Mismatched sizes told their own quiet story. Clothes chosen for availability, not for fit. A wardrobe built from what was at hand, not what was loved. "Kaiser, heel," Daniel repeated, same tone, same measure. Again the dog did not return. It wasn't defiance. It was duty lived so fully that the command had to yield to the truth it served. Kaiser's body was a paragraph written in stillness, ears forward, tail low and steady, weight distributed in that disciplined way that says, "I am ready but not reckless." Daniel could have placed a coin on the dog's back and watched it rest there unshaken. The man's smile held. "That dog is really focused," he said, aiming for admiration and landing close. "Good boy." He flicked a glance to the tote, then back, small enough to miss, bright as a pin if you knew to look. "What's his name?" the girl asked, so soft Daniel almost missed it. Her voice had the paper-thin quality of someone testing whether she was allowed to speak. "Kaiser," Daniel answered, the dog's name a warm thing on his tongue. "He's friendly when he's off duty, and very serious when he's not." He let a fraction of humor into his eyes, the kind that told people they could exhale. "Right now he's clocked in." The girl's fingers loosened in the woman's hand by a hair, then tightened again, a tide that couldn't decide how far to go. The boy's lashes were too long for the way he kept them aimed at the floor. When he shifted, his sleeve hitched, exposing the smallest blush of red where the skin met bone, faint, like an elastic had done its job too well. Not a wound, a memory. Skin keeps such good records. "What's in the bag?" Daniel asked conversationally, as if he were inquiring about a casserole recipe. He kept his eyes on the adults' faces, not the canvas. "Snacks? I always forget to pack enough for the long flights." The woman adjusted the strap, a reflex. Snacks, coloring books, a breath, wipes, each word carefully wrapped before release. "Long day for little legs," Daniel said, and in his chest something shifted, a small stone rolling into a more stable place. He was not a father, not in the biological sense, but he knew the look of a child. Comment. The windbreaker's zipper tab ticked against itself once, quick metal chatter like a nervous tick. The scarf, so pretty with its meadow of flowers, hid the woman's pulse at her throat. Daniel found himself wishing briefly for the clean honesty of a visible heartbeat. He scanned the periphery, the gate agent watching discreetly over the rim of her glasses, a security officer farther back leaning into neutral, other travelers pretending, kindly, not to notice. The scene held, nothing had broken. Yet. "Kaiser," Daniel said, third time the charm in training, knowing full well the dog would stay planted. The word was less an order now than a promise. "I'm here. I'll speak for us until you need to speak again." Kaiser answered with the slightest shift, weight forward by a breath, as if he'd set his certainty down between them on the thin carpeted floor. "Kids," Daniel tried, gentling his voice the way you do around skittish animals and startled hearts. "You excited to fly?" The girl nodded once. The boy didn't move. The nod felt like a compromise with herself. That was when Daniel noticed the smallest thing. The girl's shoes were scuffed in a way that matched no other scuff on her. The toes scraped as if she'd been made to hurry on a ground that wasn't kind. "Could I see your boarding passes?" he asked the adults, polite to the bone, hands visible, posture at ease. Just routine. The man's smile thinned but held. The woman reached for a jacket pocket, then remembered and dug into the tote, fingers sifting through the unseen. The canvas sagged and shifted with the weight of its contents, in a way that told Daniel more than the words to come. Not heavy like books, heavy like preparation. He thought, briefly, of Sergeant Morales again, and her gravelly voice, the granola bar, the warning about danger's favorite color. He thought of Kaiser's paws planted beside him, the dog's steadiness and anchor in a room full of moving water. He thought of all the mornings that had wanted to be ordinary, and the few that had insisted on being otherwise. "Take your time," he said, and meant it. He kept his eyes on what people do when they think you're watching something else. The windbreaker's zipper ticked once more and stopped. The scarf shifted. The girl's breath fluttered. The boy stood. "Thanks for your patience," Daniel said, the kind of line that had smoothed countless edges at countless gates. His tone was neighborly, the way you might borrow a cup of sugar on a Sunday afternoon. "Could I take a look at your travel documents? Just routine." The man in the Navy windbreaker went for compliance before hesitation could catch him. He reached into an inside pocket and came out with 2 plastic sleeves, boarding passes nested with IDs, held together by the neat, office-born habit of lining corners. He offered them forward with a smile that worked hard without breaking a sweat. "Absolutely, officer," he said, voice tuned to helpful. "Anything you need." From a step back, the woman's floral scarf lifted and settled with her breath, a meadow stirred by a wind only she felt. She slid her tote closer to her hip as if to make room for Daniel's view, then stilled her hand there, a palm-shaped anchor on canvas. When she reached for her wallet, her fingers trailed the zipper once, then twice, as if the metal teeth needed soothing. Daniel accepted the documents without looking away from their faces. He had learned to read the pause between gesture and expression, the micro-miss of timing that happened when someone led with what they wanted you to see, while their thoughts lagged a step behind. The man's smile landed a fraction too soon, like a door opened before the knock. The woman's smile arrived late, as if she'd had to cross a room to fetch it. "Appreciate it," Daniel said softly. He glanced down, making a ceremony of casual attention. Names, numbers, the friendly font of travel. The cards were new in the way that plastic looks new before it learns the shape of a wallet, edges sharp, laminate unscuffed. The boarding passes bore the same quick ink smell as the kiosk near B12. He returned his eyes to the adults, then let them drift, deliberately, to the children. The girl, 6 by his first guess, stood with her shoes touching, toes angled inward like she was trying to take up less space in a world that already thought her small. The boy's jacket swallowed his wrists, sleeves a soft tunnel for hands that didn't know where to go. Kaiser's gaze shifted once, not a movement so much as a deepening of attention, and Daniel felt his own breath answer it. "Where are you folks headed today?" he asked, keeping his voice even, the way you do around nerves. Nash counter, a friendly orbit, an invitation to normalcy. "Of course," the man said, his hand extended to the boy's shoulder, a little squeeze that was supposed to look like comfort. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't lean in either. He simply absorbed it, the way some children learn to absorb everything. Daniel felt the smallest drum in his chest pick up a new tempo, as if someone had set a metronome a notch faster on the piano of his ribcage. He masked the change by shifting his stance half an inch and, without fuss, touched the radio on his shoulder with the back of his wrist. The gesture had all the drama of brushing away lint. The push to talk depressed under bone for the briefest second. "Control Unit 4, he said in a tone meant for only one ear, volume more breath than sound. "Request quiet support at B17, no lights, no rush." He didn't wait for the acknowledgement he knew would come. He'd asked for help the way a person lays out extra plates at a table, not because company has already arrived, but because it might. "Thanks," he told the man, and looked to the woman with equal courtesy. "Ma'am, would you mind if I hold the tote while we chat? Easier for you." The offer framed as kindness. He didn't reach for it. He left space for consent. Her fingers whitened where they gripped the strap. The scarf rose and fell again, petals in a wind. "I've got it," she said, a touch too fast. "Thank you." "Sure," he said, backing off the point as though he'd only asked out of habit. He let silence sit down between them and put its elbows on the table. Silence can be a better interviewer than any cop. It invites truth and lies to compete for the same breath. Somewhere behind them, the speaker called a different flight. The gate agent wiped the counter with the flat of her hand as if erasing chalk. Near the window, a toddler announced with the proud certainty of discovery that airplanes were big, big birds, and two strangers laughed all the way into kindness. The airport carried on. The moment held. Daniel knelt carefully to bring his eyes level with the children's. He kept his hands visible, palms resting lightly on his thighs. Kaiser stayed upright, a sentinel carved from breath and bone. "Hey there," Daniel said to the girl, voice as gentle as a hand smoothing a wrinkled bedspread in Daniel's chest, ringing once so purely that every other sound for an instant seemed to step back to listen. He didn't show the shock. He didn't reach. He didn't let his eyes flare with the blaze he felt. He simply let one slow inhale fill his ribs and set it down where he needed it, in his legs, in his hands, in the steadiness of his voice. "Thank you," he said to the girl, two syllables lined with more gratitude than the words could carry. He glanced at the boy. The boy looked at Kaiser, and for the briefest flicker, something like relief loosened his mouth. Daniel stood, letting the motion be unhurried, an assurance that the ground was still there under all their feet. He looked at the adults and softened the edges of his tone even further. "I appreciate you working with me," he said. "I'm going to ask you to step just to the side here, better light for my scanner." He gestured to a spot 10 feet away, well within the flow of the gate, not against a wall, not a corner, a place chosen to feel safe. The man nodded, compliant as a rehearsal. The woman hesitated, fingers walking a tiny circle on the tote strap, as if tracing a prayer. Then she moved too. Kaiser matched Daniel's pivot, the leash a straight line between intention and action. The dog's head stayed level, nose pulling in data with the quiet greed of expertise. Daniel's heartbeat wrote a new rhythm against his sternum, alert, not panicked, ready, not rash. At the counter, the gate agent's eyes met his for the briefest second. Daniel lifted his chin a millimeter, a signal they'd practiced in 10 different variations over 10 different months. She nodded once, then turned to her terminal the way all gate agents do, fingers dancing. 2 rows back, a uniformed officer drifted into the periphery of the scene like a cloud shading a field. No siren song, no heavy feet, just presence. "Sir," Daniel said, looking at the man as he set the documents on the scanner, "what's your little guy's name?" The man's smile didn't falter. "Connor," he said smoothly, "and this is Emma." "Those are good names," Daniel replied, letting the kindly cadence carry him another step. He glanced at the girl again, a steady look, not searching, not exactly where he was supposed to be. He took one small step back to include everyone in the circle of his attention, the man, the woman, the children, the dog, and let the quiet do another lap. The floral scarf breathed, the windbreaker's zipper still. Kaiser's ears, perfect instruments, held their line. No voice raised, no rush, just a handler listening to a word that hadn't made a sound, and a room learning, minute by minute, how to hear it too. The smile the man gave Daniel had the polish of something kept in a pocket and rubbed between finger and thumb. "Officer, we're really late for our flight," he said, voice smoothed to airport civility. "If we miss this connection, we'll be stranded with the kids." He bent slightly at the waist, sympathetic to his own predicament, a gesture meant to recruit Daniel to his side of the line. "I hear you," Daniel answered, easy as Sunday light. He kept his stance open, one foot half a shoe length ahead of the other, the kind of posture that says, "I'm listening," without promising anything else. "Denver's a beast to connect through. Let's make it quick so you don't miss a thing." He glanced toward the gate agent, who worked her keyboard with the calm of someone who had seen every version of delay and wouldn't let this be another. The concourse kept humming around them, wheels on tile, overhead calls braided with the scent of espresso and lemon cleaner, a toddler's delighted squeal at the sight of a plane unspooling its shadow along the glass. Kaiser broke his statue-still post and began to pace in a tight, deliberate arc, the leash floating between his collar and Daniel's hand like a line drawn with a steady ruler. He didn't crowd anyone. He simply let his nose read the air in front of the canvas tote, as if the bag were a sentence, and the scent was the grammar. The dog's mouth closed, then opened to a small, quiet pant. His ears angled, then held. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like restlessness. To Daniel, it was Kaiser tightening the focus of a lens. The woman noticed first. Her hand slipped up the strap and, with the smallest shrug of shoulder, she moved the tote to the far side of her body, away from Kaiser's gentle arc. The scarf followed, a soft bloom of flowers turning with her, a field relocated by inches. It was a motion she made like second nature. "Happened to miss boarding. We'll walk you over to the agent and make it right." The man nodded rapidly, acceptance without agreement. "Thanks, that's helpful." His eyes skipped from Daniel to the scanner to Kaiser, then back to Daniel, where they tried to stay and couldn't quite. Around his wrist, the watch strap had left a shallow impression. He ran his thumb along it, a nervous kindness to himself. Kaiser's pacing drew a neat semicircle and returned him to Daniel's knee. The shepherd's tail rested at half-mast, not flagging, not tucked, just steady. He leaned a whisper toward the tote, nose skimming the air like a pen not quite touching paper. The boy watched him with the solemn relief of a child who has found the one honest thing in a room full of adults and is trying not to stare. The girl stood very still, the way some children do when they've learned stillness can be mistaken for goodness. "Connor, Emma," Daniel said lightly, borrowing the names the man had offered earlier, letting them live in his mouth with care. "Hold tight for me, okay? We'll be done before you can count to 20. He lifted his hand at knee level, palm open. Kaiser's ears ticked back, heard, then forward again. The woman made an effort at a laugh that fell short of where laughter usually lands. "They're fine," she said, and her fingers walked a small path on the tote strap as if to soothe the canvas itself. "We really do need to go." The smile she pasted on afterward was careful, perfectly adequate, and half an inch to the left of her eyes. "I know that feeling," Daniel answered, tone soft enough to welcome, firm enough to hold the floor. "I've jogged more concourses than I care to admit." He tilted his head toward the windows without looking away from them. "Nothing like seeing your plane sitting there while the clock runs faster than your legs." The man tried humor on like a jacket. "Story of my life," he said. It didn't fit. He adjusted his grip on the boy's shoulder, a micro-squeeze that telegraphed "stay with me" more than "it's okay." Kaiser edged a step forward, nose hovering near the tote's bottom seam, and drew a quiet breath through his nostrils, a technician taking a measurement. The woman shifted again, just a sliver, and the bag floated out of the dog's line like a moon slipping behind cloud. On another day, Daniel might have a please as if to soften the edges he'd just drawn. "Please." "Sure," Daniel said, accepting the refusal the way a river accepts a stone and simply runs around it. He didn't push. The work now was to keep the current calm so the silt would settle and the water would turn clear. He measured his breath, let it slow until his ribs remembered the easier tempo of earlier, and in that space he could hear his own heartbeat ticking, present and useful. A pre-boarding call rose from the speaker, a companionable voice that apologized for delays it hadn't caused. Half a dozen travelers stood because half a dozen always do, and the gate agent raised a palm in a stop sign that turned their momentum into a shuffle. Daniel caught her eye for a blink, and in that blink she knew everything she needed to know. Not yet. Almost. Hold the door with your smile. Kaiser's pacing resumed, this time a tighter crescent, his nose drawing a thin map along the air. He did not bump knees or make noise beyond the soft rhythm of breath and paw. The children's attention gravitated toward him as attention does toward a steady thing. The girl's shoulders, bunched high, slid down a notch. The boy's hands, hidden in two long sleeves, flexed against fabric like small birds testing weak light. "Good boy," Daniel murmured, not so much to reward as to acknowledge the work of quiet. Praise, he'd learned, is a kind of leash, too. It tells a partner you see what they're holding, and you'll hold your part. The woman tracked Kaiser's arc with a gaze she tried to keep casual. "He's very thorough," she said. It might have been a compliment. It landed like a complaint whispered through a smile. "He is," Daniel agreed, letting the pride in his voice be soft enough not to provoke. "He keeps me from missing what matters." He turned half a degree to include the kids in his field of attention again. "You two like dogs?" The girl's chin made the smallest rise, a yes that didn't risk words. The boy nodded without lifting his eyes. Kaiser paused and looked up, just once, long enough for the girl to see her reflection in his dark, clean gaze. Something answered in her shoulders. "We're late," the man said again, the words now carrying a layer of urgency he didn't let touch his face. "Can we go?" "And I'm right here with you," Daniel replied. Stubborn truth that Daniel could feel, but not yet name. Kaiser eased closer to the tote's opposite side as the woman swung it away again. Her smile stretched thinner now, the scarf's flowers a little too bright in the strong light. The dog's chest rose and fell, and in that breath Daniel recognized a pattern he'd seen in 100 small rooms and hallways. The steady, professional insistence that says, "This deserves our attention." Not a warning made of teeth, a boundary made of presence. He decided to borrow the dog's tone. "I know you're in a rush," Daniel said, and let the empathy be true. "And I know the kids are tired. You're doing fine. I'm going to keep this calm and simple." He tipped the documents toward the scanner again. "If everything checks out, I'll be the one holding the door open for you." The man's jaw worked once, the way a person resets their smile. "Thank you," he managed, and the words looked heavier than they should have. The woman's fingers tightened and released on the strap, a pulse measured in canvas. She moved the bag another inch, and the inch said more than any sentence she might have offered. Kaiser stopped pacing. He settled into a stance that Daniel had come to think of as the dog's full attention made visible. Front paws square, head level, eyes patient and precise. The shepherd didn't look at the crowd or the agent or even at Daniel. He looked at the small world of 4 and breathed like someone counting to keep time. Daniel followed that tempo. He set the passes on the counter with care, as if the paper had feelings about how it was handled. He let his voice find the middle of the room again, warm and ordinary. Almost there. Late or not, the couple was staying where they were. That was enough for now. The refusal had been as polite as the request, and beneath it the ground had shifted by inches, not feet. But in this work, inches mattered. They were how you crossed a river without falling in. They were how you made space for the smallest voice in the room to finally be heard. It started as a ripple, small enough that no one would have named it. A moment ago, the flow of travelers around gate B17 had been easy and unbroken, a steady current of carry-ons, coffee cups, and conversations passing without notice. Now, capture the scene under the guise of checking messages. A woman in a denim jacket held hers in both hands, thumbs idle above the glass. Two teens swapped glances and pretended to watch the departure board, their camera lenses tilted like curious eyes. Daniel kept his gaze on the couple, his tone even, the words measured. The trick was to let nothing in his face or posture betray the fact that he'd noticed the change. Any shift in his own demeanor might signal to the man and woman that they were being watched by more than just him, and that could snap the thin thread of calm holding the moment together. Out in the periphery, movement from the uniforms began, so slight it might have been mistaken for coincidence. A TSA officer broke from his post at a nearby gate, ambling in their direction with the aimless gait of someone looking for a trash can. Another, a young woman with her hair pulled into a neat bun, slowed her patrol just enough to keep the scene in her sight line. They were not approaching with purpose yet. This was the drift before the current took hold. Kaiser's pacing had quieted, but he remained alert, nostrils sampling the air, eyes moving between the tote and the children. To anyone else, he looked like a working dog going through his routines. To Daniel, each pass of the shepherd's nose was a bead on a string, marking the pattern of something that didn't belong. Behind the couple, a man in a business suit had stopped scrolling and was openly watching, one finger tapping the edge of his phone. A flight attendant in a crisp navy blazer, waiting to deadhead to her next assignment, shifted her position to lean against the gate counter, her eyes calm but fixed. This was how awareness spread, quietly, from one set of eyes to the next, until the space itself seemed to be listening. Daniel caught a flash of motion in his peripheral vision. Officer Hughes, in plain clothes today, moving down the concourse. He had a coffee in one hand, his badge nowhere in sight, and he didn't so much as glance toward Daniel. But his path was deliberate, angling closer with every casual step. They'd worked enough gates together to read each other without a nod. The couple hadn't fully clocked the shift. The man's attention kept darting to the gate agent, measuring the boarding process, calculating how much time remained. The woman adjusted the tote again, hugging it close on her far needed reassurance. Let's just get this squared away. He didn't raise his volume. The words were meant for their ears, but the steadiness in his tone was a quiet signal to anyone watching that he had control of the moment. The drift of security staff continued, subtle as shadows lengthening with the day. A bag screener from a nearby checkpoint appeared at the edge of the gate area, pretending to study the monitor mounted above the counter. The gate agent, catching Daniel's earlier glance, began moving more slowly through her tasks, buying time without ever pausing her work. Passengers who might have walked straight past were now altering their routes, looping wide or pretending to look for seating that happened to give them a better view. The air between Daniel and the couple felt the same, but beyond that bubble, a second layer of awareness had formed. It wasn't hostile, wasn't panicked. It was the quiet vigilance of people registering that something mattered here. Kaiser paused mid-step, head turning just slightly, ears tuning to a sound Daniel didn't catch. Then the dog resumed his slow prowl, passing again near the tote. This time, Daniel saw the woman's grip tighten, her thumb pressing into the canvas, as if she could keep its contents from spilling out into the world. Daniel let his eyes flick just once to Hughes, who had reached a spot 15 feet away and stopped, bending to retie a shoe that didn't need it. From that crouch he could see everything: the couple, the kids, the bag, and the dog who would not give up his post. The crowd's murmur had changed too. It was softer now, lower in pitch, as though the concourse itself had lowered its voice. Conversations were being kept close, words tucked between hands shielding mouths. A woman near the seating area leaned toward her companion, whispering something that made him look up sharply. Daniel kept his own breathing slow, his weight even between both feet. In the stillness he maintained, he could feel the scene tilting, not yet tipping, but shifting toward a point where decisions would need to be made. He wanted to be the one to choose when. Somewhere a phone camera shutter clicked. The sound was soft, but not soft enough to escape the man's notice. He glanced toward the source, his smile thinning before he brought it back. The woman didn't look up. Her focus seemed to be on the invisible barrier she was building between Kaiser and her bag. Between a calm resolution and chaos was often no more than the space of a breath, and for now he intended to own every one of them. Daniel had been here before, standing in that narrow space between what his eyes told him and what his gut, sharpened by years in uniform, whispered in reply. But today there was a third voice, one that mattered most, the dog at his side. Kaiser had stopped pacing. His paws were set square, weight evenly distributed, tail still. His head was low but not in submission. It was angled toward the tote like a compass needle locked to true north. And then it came, that sound Daniel almost never heard from him during a public inspection. Not a bark, not the light chuff of casual alert. A growl. It was low and deliberate, a vibration born deep in the chest, shaped into a quiet warning. Not for the crowd, not for show. This was for Daniel alone, a message carried through the leash and up his arm like a current. This isn't background noise. This is the thing. The sound was enough to nudge the entire atmosphere half a degree tighter. The woman's hand twitched on the tote strap, her knuckles pressing white against the canvas. The man's smile stiffened, still pinned in place but brittle at the edges. Daniel could feel the children's stillness more than see it. Their energy had gone into holding themselves smaller, as if any movement might matter. This was the crossroad. He could tell himself it was nothing, a stressed family on a tight schedule, an overprotective mother with her bag, a trained dog just catching some odd scent in the chaos of an airport. He could wave them on, chalk it up to overcaution, and be the officer who didn't make them miss their flight. That was the human doubt talking, the part that wanted to avoid making a scene, avoid the risk of being wrong. But the other choice was the one that had been keeping him alive since he'd put on a badge. Listen to the partner who didn't know how to lie, who'd been trained to read the air in ways no human could. Kaiser's instincts had been honed on hundreds of hours of detection work, but this still wasn't just training. It was something older, deeper. This was the part of the dog that knew when the world was about to tilt. The growl faded, but the weight of it stayed in Daniel's bones. He glanced down and met Kaiser's eyes, steady, intent, unkind, but with the precision of someone who's no longer debating the point. It'll be faster if we handle this here and now. He gestured subtly toward a space near the window, a location that gave him open sight lines and enough room for backup to move in quietly if needed. The woman's eyes flicked toward the gate, calculating. She adjusted the tote again, keeping it close, and Daniel caught the faintest hitch in her breath. The scarf shifted with her movement, a garden caught in a restless wind. Kaiser moved with him as Daniel took a small step forward, the leash a steady bridge between them. The shepherd's body language was a masterclass in controlled focus. No lunging, no noise, just presence. Every line from ear to paw pointed toward the four people in front of him. Out of the corner of his eye, Daniel saw Officer Hughes, still in plain clothes, change position, his coffee now cradled in both hands. Another security officer, the one with the hair bun, had found a vantage point near the seating area, posture loose, gaze sharp. The man tried one more time.
The kids. I understand, Daniel replied.
He didn't reach for the tote, he just waited. In these moments, silence was more persuasive than pressure. It left people to wrestle with the decision themselves. Her fingers flexed on the canvas, nails briefly indenting the fabric before she slid the strap down from her shoulder. It was an act too deliberate to be casual, a handoff she wanted to control. She placed the bag in his hands as if it were a living thing that might bite. Kaiser's nose dipped immediately toward the seam, drawing in air with the deep, purposeful breath of a craftsman inspecting his tools. His ears stayed forward, tail low and still. Daniel didn't need the leash to feel the dog's interest. It traveled up through the leather like a pulse. The tote was heavy in a way that didn't match the sound it made when set on the counter. Not the dense, shifting weight of clothes or the soft rattle of snacks. There was a center to it, a steadiness that spoke of objects designed to stay put. Daniel unzipped it slowly, the metal teeth parting with a dry whisper. On top lay the promised snacks, 2 small bags of animal crackers, a couple of juice boxes, a rolled pack of coloring pages wrapped with a dull pink hair tie. Perfectly innocent, perfectly staged. He shifted the crackers aside and found a pack of wipes, a travel-sized bottle of hand sanitizer, a crumpled tissue. All fine, all meant to be seen. But the bottom looked wrong. Canvas bags tend to sag into their contents, collapsing to the shape of whatever they hold. This one didn't. The floor of the tote was too flat, too stiff under his palm. Daniel pressed lightly with his fingers and felt the faint give of material layered over something solid. Kaiser's nostrils flared again. The shepherd's head angled closer, and a low rumble, not the sharpness of a growl, but a sound of certainty, bubbled in his throat. Daniel looked up at the woman. Her face was carefully composed, but her gaze had fixed on his hands with the intensity of someone watching a door they didn't want opened. "False bottom?" he asked lightly, as if the words were just an observation, nothing more. She didn't answer. With deliberate care, Daniel lifted the bag's lining along the seam. It resisted for a second, then folded back to reveal a narrow compartment stitched with skill. Inside, the light caught on a stack of objects that had nothing early. "The first look belongs to your eyes, not your hands." He let each object settle in his mind, building its own place in the story forming there. Pills to keep someone quiet, multiple identities, a phone meant to vanish, all hidden under a layer of normal. Kaiser's tail gave a single, slow wag, the kind he gave when the search was over because the answer had been found. Daniel met the woman's gaze again. "You keep a lot in here," he said quietly, his tone still even but weighted now, the way a doorframe bears weight when a house starts to shift. Her mouth opened, closed. "They're not mine," she said finally. The words were shaped too quickly, as if they'd been waiting behind her teeth. Daniel didn't challenge her, not yet. He simply re-zipped the tote halfway, enough to keep the contents from spilling, but not enough to hide the truth from view. Then he set it on the counter between them, like a piece of evidence placed gently but firmly on the table of a negotiation. Around them, the gate area kept its rhythm. Boarding groups were called for another flight 2 gates down. A rolling bag clipped the edge of a seat. Somewhere, a child laughed at something on a tablet. But within the small circle where Daniel stood with the couple, the air had shifted again. It had the feel of a curtain being drawn back, sunlight spilling into a room where dust motes hung in sudden clarity. He took a step back, not to give them space, but to make room for what came next. "Sir, ma'am," he said, "we're going to have to talk about what's in this bag." The man's jaw tightened. The woman's hand twitched toward the tote, then stopped. And Kaiser, silent now, stayed close enough that his shadow touched Daniel's boots, eyes fixed on the bag that had told them more than its owner ever meant it to. Daniel had been trained to read micro-expressions, to notice the way a jaw clenched or a hand curled when a question landed too close to the truth. But nothing in the academy had prepared him for the weight of a small, trembling hand closing around his sleeve. It happened quietly, almost shyly, so unlike the noisy defiance or panic he often saw in tense encounters. The girl, maybe 6 years old, had stepped forward without a word, her fingers finding the fabric of his uniform as though it were a lifeline. She didn't tug, the gravity of the moment, didn't move a muscle. His head remained up, alert, but the tip of his tail brushed once against the boy's side, a small, unspoken reassurance. Daniel felt it then, not suspicion, not procedure, but something heavier. These children weren't just nervous about being stopped at an airport. They were afraid of the very people they'd arrived with. The realization sank into him like cold water, slowing his breath. Training told him to keep his tone even, his questions precise. Instinct told him to lower his voice, to become something softer than the uniform on his back. He crouched slightly to meet the girl's gaze without towering over her. "You okay?" he asked, voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the small circle of space they occupied. Her lips parted, but the sound didn't come. Instead, she gave the smallest shake of her head, barely a movement, but enough. The boy's eyes peeked out from behind Kaiser's fur, wide and unblinking. He didn't speak either, but his fingers were buried deep in the shepherd's coat, knuckles pale from the force of his grip. Behind them, the woman's voice sharpened. "Kids, come here." It wasn't a request. Neither moved. Daniel straightened slowly, his own body positioning now deliberate, between the children and the couple. "It's all right," he said, though the words were for the kids. His eyes stayed on the adults. The man shifted his weight, a defensive posture Daniel had seen 100 times in holding rooms and interrogation booths. His gaze flicked to the bag on the counter, then to the children, then back to Daniel.
"They're just tired," he said quickly. "They're not used to travel." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The girl's small hand was still fixed on his sleeve, and the boy hadn't moved from behind Kaiser's steady flank. Their silence was louder than any denial the adults could give. In the periphery, Daniel felt the air changing again, the hum of nearby conversations thinning, the faint static of security radios blending with the shuffle of feet as more eyes turned toward the scene. But in the center of it, it was just them. A man, a woman, two frightened children, a shepherd who could read fear like scent, and a handler whose heartbeat had shifted from professional detachment to something far more personal. He knew what came next wouldn't just be about the contents of a bag or the inconsistencies in a story. Officers stepped into his peripheral view. One was Officer Patel, a familiar face with a calm, almost pastoral presence that Daniel had always appreciated in tense situations. The other, Officer Mason, carried himself with that particular economy of movement that came from years of dealing with unpredictable travelers. Daniel gave them a quick glance, the kind that communicated both urgency and control. "We'll need to separate them," he said in a level tone, as though discussing a gate change instead of a potential trafficking situation. His voice carried no accusation, just the kind of procedural certainty that left little room for argument. Patel nodded, moving subtly toward the man in the navy windbreaker. Mason approached the woman in the floral scarf, his expression unreadable but his eyes alert. "I'm going to have my colleagues speak with you separately," Daniel explained to the couple, still using that same unhurried cadence. "Just routine questions so we can get you on your way." The man's jaw flexed, but he didn't protest. The woman's fingers tightened around the tote strap, knuckles blanching as she kept it slung over her far shoulder, away from Kaiser's reach. As the officers guided them a few steps apart, far enough that their voices wouldn't overlap, but close enough to keep the situation contained, Daniel turned back to the children. The girl still clung to his sleeve, her grip lighter now but not gone. The boy was pressed so firmly into Kaiser's side that Daniel wondered if the shepherd had shifted slightly to give him more cover. "Kaiser, stay," Daniel murmured. The dog's ears flicked in acknowledgement, his posture still alert but softened in the way only a working dog could manage when he knew the real work was right in front of him. The children seemed to feel it too. The girl's shoulders loosened fractionally, and the boy's breathing began to match the slow, steady rise and fall of Kaiser's flank. Daniel had seen it before, how the presence of a calm, confident dog could cut through layers of fear faster than any words. Patel caught Daniel's eye from where he was speaking to the man. His subtle shake of the head said enough. The story wasn't adding up. On the other side, Mason's brows drew together briefly before smoothing again, another silent cue that the woman's answers were raising more questions than they settled. "Would you like some water?" Daniel asked the children, keeping his tone, was maintaining the fragile sense of safety that had begun to take root in these few short minutes. In his experience, the way you detained someone set the tone for everything that followed. This wasn't about force, it was about control, presence, and the quiet assurance, spoken or not, that the children weren't alone anymore. Kaiser seemed to understand this perfectly. He lay down beside them, his massive frame forming a physical and psychological barrier between the kids and the chaos just a few yards away. The boy's fingers found their way back into the dog's fur, and the girl leaned slightly toward Daniel, her eyes still cautious but less guarded than before. For the first time since Kaiser's initial bark, Daniel let himself believe they might be stepping into a space where the children's voices, silent now, would eventually be heard. The interrogation room was quiet enough that Daniel could hear the faint hum of the overhead light, a steady, low vibration that seemed to settle in the back of his skull. It was the kind of space designed to strip away comfort, pale walls without adornment, a table too small for comfort, two metal chairs facing each other with a second pair pushed back against the wall. No clock, no window, just the silent pressure of time. Across from him sat Evelyn and Mark Dawson. They'd been booked under those names, though Daniel suspected that at least one of them wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Evelyn's floral scarf was gone now, folded neatly on the table as though she'd prepared for a polite tea service instead of questioning. Her posture was precise, hands clasped loosely, shoulders relaxed, expression open but non-committal. She was the kind of person who knew how to look composed under fluorescent lights. Mark was the opposite. The navy windbreaker hung loose over his broad shoulders, the zipper pulled halfway up as if to create a barrier. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, arms crossed in a way that told Daniel he wasn't planning to say much. His gaze slid past Daniel to the corner of the room, where the camera's black eye observed everything. "Evelyn, Mark," Daniel began, his tone warm enough to pass for casual. "I appreciate you sitting down with me. I know airports can be stressful. Long lines, tight schedules, kids in tow." Evelyn smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lit. "Are they yours?" Evelyn's answer came smoothly. "Yes, our niece and nephew. Their parents couldn't travel, so we're taking them to visit family." "Nice of you," Daniel said, nodding as though in agreement. "Family's important. What are their parents' names?" Evelyn hesitated for the briefest moment, a pause so slight most people might have missed it, but Daniel had been reading micro-delays for years. "Laura and Stephen," she said finally. "And their last name?" She glanced at Mark before answering. "Dawson." Mark's eyes shifted toward her then, not in alarm, but in a way that suggested they hadn't rehearsed every detail together. Daniel filed it away. "You must be close with them," Daniel continued, voice still mild. "Kids seemed comfortable with you." "They're shy around strangers," Evelyn said. "Funny," Daniel said lightly, "because they seemed pretty comfortable with Kaiser. You know, our shepherd. Most kids are a little intimidated at first." Evelyn's hands shifted in her lap, clasp tightening. "They like dogs." Daniel smiled faintly, letting his eyes drop to the notepad in front of him. He made a small, deliberate note, nothing more than a line, but the act of writing often nudged people to fill the silence. Evelyn didn't bite, but Mark's crossed arms flexed slightly, his foot tapping once against the floor before going still again. "Where are you headed?" Daniel asked. "Chicago," Evelyn answered. "For how long?" "A week." Daniel looked up, tilting his head slightly. "And you packed for them in that tote bag?" Mark's jaw tightened again, but it was Evelyn who answered. "It's just carry-on. Most of their things are already with family." Daniel said, nodding slowly. "And the medication?" Evelyn's eyes flickered. "One of them gets motion sick, just a precaution." Daniel let his pen rest against the notepad. "It's interesting, usually for motion sickness you see Dramamine, maybe ginger chews, but these were stronger." Mark finally spoke, his voice low and edged. "Are we under arrest?" Daniel met his gaze without blinking. "Not at the moment. We're just having a conversation, unless you'd prefer a different one." Mark's stare was steady, but there was something under it, an assessment, as if he was recalculating what Daniel intended to dismantle, brick by brick if he had to. What mattered now wasn't forcing them to confess. It was letting their own words start pulling at the threads they'd tried so hard to keep neat. And in that small, sterile room, Daniel could already see the first loose ends. The air in the interrogation room seemed to thicken, not with heat, but with the quiet pressure of things unsaid. Daniel had seen this moment before, the hinge where silence either snaps into confession or hardens into something that will take hours to crack. Evelyn's eyes were still on him, but her posture had changed in ways most wouldn't notice. The slight forward lean, the way her clasped hands now pressed together as if holding something in. Kaiser lay stretched out in the far corner, head resting on his paws, his dark eyes half-lidded. He had been the picture of calm for most of the questioning, content to stay close but not intrusive. Now, as Evelyn shifted in her chair, his ears flicked forward. "I suppose," Evelyn began, her voice softer now,
There's no point in pretending we were just taking them for a vacation. Daniel kept his expression neutral, though inside he felt the faint click of a puzzle piece sliding into place. Go on. We're moving them, she said. The pause between words was deliberate, as if she was testing how the phrase would sound in the open air. From one place to another. Why? Daniel asked, keeping his tone even, careful not to push too hard too soon. Evelyn's gaze dropped to her clasped hands. Because where they were wasn't good for them. It was a half-truth. He could feel it in the cadence of her voice. She was offering him the shape of the story without its core. Kaiser lifted his head, the soft scrape of his claws on the floor drawing both their attention. His gaze was fixed on her, ears angled forward, nostrils flaring slightly. To anyone else it might have looked like idle curiosity. To Daniel, it was a tell. Kaiser had spent years reading the subtlest cues from people, changes in tone, shifts in breathing, the invisible tremor of adrenaline under the skin. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Who asked you to move them? Evelyn shook her head. That doesn't matter. Imperceptible rumble filled the space between them. Daniel didn't glance at him. He didn't need to. That growl wasn't aggression. It was Kaiser's version of a finger tapping on the table. Something here was wrong. You're holding something back, Daniel said, his voice still measured but edged with certainty. You know who put this plan in motion, and until you tell me, you're carrying all the risk for whatever they've done, or plan to do. Evelyn looked past him, toward the mirrored wall, as if she could see through to the observers on the other side. For a moment, Daniel thought she might double down on her silence, but when she spoke, the words came slowly, each one weighed before release. They told us it was safe, she said. Who? She shook her head again, a reflexive denial. It doesn't matter. What matters is getting the kids out of where they were. Daniel kept his voice soft, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. If you believe that, you wouldn't be afraid to tell me their name. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken things. Kaiser shifted again, his gaze still pinned to her. Daniel had worked with him long enough to trust that focus. It was never random. You think you're protecting them, Daniel continued, but you're not. You're protecting someone else. And they're the reason those children looked at me the way they did out there, in fear. That landed. Evelyn's lips pressed together, the muscles in her jaw tightening before she exhaled. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me, Daniel said. She leaned back, eyes flicking once toward Mark's empty chair. He was in another room by now, probably offering his own edited version of events. When she looked at Daniel again, her voice had shifted, the veneer of calm cracking just enough to reveal the strain beneath. If I tell you, she said, I want to know the kids will be safe. Daniel didn't promise immediately. False assurances only bought short-term gains. They're safer here than they've been in a long time, but I can't protect them from what I don't see coming. Her fingers tightened in her lap. We were told to get them to Chicago. No questions, no delays. By who? Her eyes darted toward Kaiser, then back to Daniel. I can't. Daniel studied her for a long moment, the hum of the overhead blueprint of a crime in motion. Daniel stood at its edge, sleeves rolled up, the muted hum of the airport's overnight shift bleeding faintly through the walls. One by one he laid the items out in clean rows, like puzzle pieces that didn't yet touch, but somehow belonged to the same picture. On the far left, the tote bag from earlier, still smelling faintly of snack food and plastic. Beside it, the false bottom insert they'd pried out, fiberglass edges worn smooth from use, as if it had been dropped into more than one bag before today. Next to that, 3 passports, each a different nationality, each bearing the same children's faces, but with different names. He picked one up, flipping through its stiff pages. The ink on the entry stamps was too clean, no smudge of hurried border control, no faint bleed from moisture. It was the work of someone who had time, skill, and access to templates. IDs, came the voice of Officer Marquez from the doorway. She carried a manila envelope, fat with plastic cards. Found these in Dawson's carry-on. Daniel took it, spreading the cards across the table. Driver's licenses, school IDs, even a laminated bus pass, all with the same 2 children, all under aliases. None of them matched the names on the forged passports. Kaiser, lying by the table's leg, stirred. His nose twitched toward the pile, nostrils pulling in the faint scent of the bag's previous carriers. Daniel knew that scent could tell more than paperwork ever could. It carried the trace of rooms, hands, and miles traveled. On the right side of the table lay the forged travel itineraries, printed on heavy stock to mimic airline e-tickets. Daniel ran a thumb over the glossy surface, feeling the subtle raised edge of ink from a high-end laser printer. The destination fields shifted from document to document: Chicago, Vancouver, Madrid. All within a 2-week span. All impossible for one legitimate guardian to manage without raising suspicion, unless no one ever checked the names in sequence. Marquez moved closer, scanning the spread. Whoever built this didn't do it for the first time. You can see the layers. Daniel nodded, pulling the passports closer to the itineraries. And they're not moving kids to one place. They're moving them through places. Each leg of the trip reached protective custody a few rooms away. The girl's small fingers gripping his sleeve, the boy's silent refuge behind Kaiser's flank. That wasn't just fear of strangers. It was the reflex of kids who had learned to stay invisible around the people moving them. He turned one of the itineraries toward Marquez. Look at the layover in Montreal. 4 hours. That's not a mistake. It's a handoff window. Marquez leaned over the table, tracing a finger from one fake ticket to the next. Every one of these routes has a midpoint layover, sometimes international, sometimes just across state lines. The destination doesn't matter. The journey's the camouflage. Kaiser's ears flicked, his gaze following the slow movement of the officer's hand. Daniel reached down absently, giving the dog a reassuring scratch. "What's your read?" Marquez asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is trafficking, not the grab-and-run kind, the conveyor belt kind. Someone upstream decides where the kids end up, and everyone else is just moving parts." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the fluorescent light above suddenly loud. Daniel's mind was already building the next steps. Interpol alerts, cross-checking serial numbers on the forged IDs, pulling surveillance footage from every layover listed. He glanced down at Kaiser, who was watching him steadily, as if the dog knew the weight of what they'd uncovered. "We're not just breaking up a pickup," Daniel said almost to himself. "We're stepping onto the tracks of the whole train." And trains, he thought grimly, didn't stop easily. The conference room at Denver International had been stripped of its usual administrative clutter and transformed into a command center overnight. A portable projector hummed at the far end of the table, throwing a wide digital map onto the wall. Red pins clustered across the U.S. like a rash: coastal cities, inland airports, even small regional hubs most travelers couldn't place without a map. Daniel stood at the edge of the table, arms crossed, watching as the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force lead, Special Agent Whitaker, moved a laser pointer from Denver to Atlanta. "This," Whitaker said, tapping the pin over Denver, "is just one node in a much larger network. We've confirmed similar incidents in Dallas, Seattle, Boston, and LAX over the last 18 months. Same operational patterns, clean forged document." His notepad. 2 TSA supervisors leaned closer to see the details on the map. Kaiser lay at Daniel's feet, ears twitching at the undercurrent of tension in the room. Daniel could feel the dog's steady presence like a weight on an anchor chain, keeping him grounded as the scale of the operation sank in. Whitaker clicked to the next slide, side-by-side photos of seized documents. "Notice the consistency. Different print shops, different forgers, but the same stock, the same lamination type. This isn't freelance. This is supply from a central source, distributed to cells across the country. Daniel stepped forward, eyes on the photo of the forged passports he'd taken from the Dawsons. That's exactly what we found in our case. Same weight paper, same bevel on the edge of the laminate. Whitaker nodded once, marking it on her notes. We've had DHS flag that profile, but the lag in data sharing between ports of entry is giving them cover. We're working on a workaround, but until then, each intercept has to be boots on the ground. The room was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the projector. Daniel could feel the shared understanding passing between everyone present. This wasn't a one and done. This was a war fought in terminals and jetways, with each small victory only a temporary disruption in the machine. Whitaker's laser dot landed on Denver again. Your case gives us the most complete chain of custody we've seen so far. Suspects in custody, live witnesses, and unbroken evidence. If we can flip one of them, we might get names higher up. Daniel's mind went back to Evelyn's carefully measured words in the interrogation room, the way her eyes had slid away when the topic of who hired them came up. There was room there, a crack, if he could find the right wedge. Where are we on coordination with Atlanta? Daniel asked. Joint Task Force is spinning up there now, Whitaker said, but they've got a bigger problem. The hub isn't tied to one airport. It's a moving target. Sometimes Hartsfield-Jackson, sometimes Savannah, sometimes even Charlotte if they need to split traffic. It's meant to keep us chasing smoke. Marquez leaned in from the far side of the table. So we have to bait them into moving, then be ready to hit on the transfer. Whitaker's mouth curved. His eyes stayed on the darkened map, already seeing the paths they'd need to block. Then we'd better start making noise in the right places. The visitation room wasn't much. 4 pale yellow walls, a scattering of worn beanbag chairs, a low table with coloring books stacked in the middle. But compared to the chaos of the airport, or the stark sterility of an interrogation room, it felt like a soft landing, a place where the air didn't hum with suspicion or threat. Daniel paused at the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the slower rhythm inside. The girl sat cross-legged on a beanbag, her hair falling forward as she worked intently on a page of dolphins leaping through waves. The boy was on the floor beside her, lining up crayons by length and color. It was the kind of small, normal act that only looked ordinary if you didn't know what they'd just come through. Kaiser padded in ahead of him, nails clicking lightly on the linoleum, tail giving a slow wag. The children's heads came up in unison. The boy's face broke into a small, cautious smile. The girl didn't smile at first. Her eyes searched Kaiser like she was making sure he was really here, really safe. Then her shoulders loosened. Child Services had a caseworker stationed in the corner, a young woman in a charcoal sweater who looked like she'd been trained to be invisible. She nodded to Daniel but didn't interrupt. "Hey," Daniel said quietly, crouching to their level. "I thought you might like some company." Kaiser eased down between the children, resting his head on his paws, as if he'd been here 100 times before. The boy reached out immediately, fingers tangling in the thick fur behind Kaiser's ears. The girl was slower. She put her crayon down, slid off the beanbag, and sat cross-legged next to him, hands folded in her lap. "You okay?" Daniel asked her. She nodded, a quick, small movement. Then she looked at him directly for the first time. Is he gonna go?" Her voice was so soft that Daniel had to lean in to hear. He followed her gaze to Kaiser, who was now half dozing under the boy's steady petting. "Not right this second," Daniel said, "but he's got work to do." Her lips pressed together. A long moment passed before she spoke again. "Can he stay? Just a little longer?" It hit Daniel in organizing his crayons. Daniel stayed where he was, letting the silence stretch. Sometimes silence was better than any reassurance you could give. It gave people space to start piecing themselves back together. He watched the girl's breathing slow, matching the steady rise and fall of Kaiser's chest. He saw the boy's posture ease, as if the order he was making with his crayons was spilling inward too. There was still a long road ahead for them, questions to answer, trauma to process, futures to rebuild. But for now, the air in the room felt different, less like a holding space and more like a place where something good could take root. Daniel didn't realize until then that he'd been holding his own breath. When he finally let it out, it felt like letting go of a weight he didn't know he'd been carrying. The briefing room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copier toner, a combination Daniel had come to associate with big moves and bigger risks. A wide map of the eastern United States was pinned to the corkboard, marked with a spider web of red strings and pushpins. Atlanta sat in the center like a heartbeat, pulsing under the fluorescent lights. Daniel stood near the back, arms crossed, Kaiser lying at his feet. The German shepherd's ears swiveled, tracking every voice, every shift in tone. He was the only one in the room who didn't look tired. At the head of the table, Special Agent Rivera of the FBI clicked through slides that were more than just evidence. They were snapshots of something vast and ugly. Surveillance photos, passenger manifests, names connected by thin red lines that branched into dozens of other names. Denver was not an isolated incident, Rivera said, voice low and measured. It was a test run. Our intel suggests that these children were just two of many being moved through secondary airports to avoid scrutiny. Atlanta is a primary distribution point. If we shut it down, we don't just save whoever's in the next wave, we cut the head off this network. The words distribution point landed like lead. Daniel didn't have to glance down to know Kaiser's breathing had slowed into that intense stillness he only got when something wasn't right. Rivera's eyes scanned the room before locking on Daniel. We need someone who knows the suspect profiles, someone the kids responded to, and someone with a dog that can pick up a scent even after it's been masked. That's a shipment through within the week. A murmur went through the room at the word shipment. Daniel hated how clinical it sounded, like they were talking about crates or pallets instead of breathing, terrified kids. He glanced at Kaiser, whose amber eyes met his without a blink. It wasn't human conversation, but the exchange felt like one. We've been here before. We can do this. Rivera clicked to the next slide. Photos from other cities: Jacksonville, Memphis, Charlotte. Each image carried the same undercurrent. Kids looking anywhere but at the camera, adults with bland, forgettable faces that melted into a crowd. This isn't about two children anymore, Rivera said. This is about dismantling the infrastructure that moves them. If we fail, they'll adapt and keep going. If we succeed— She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew what success would mean. Daniel felt that old shift inside him, the one from reactive to proactive, from responding to danger to hunting it down. Then we make sure we succeed, he said. Rivera's mouth curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. That's the idea. Wheels up at 0600. As the meeting broke apart, Daniel knelt to secure Kaiser's harness, running a hand along the dog's side in a slow, grounding motion. Looks like we're not done yet, partner. Kaiser gave a soft, almost inaudible chuff, the kind he reserved for moments when he was ready to work. The stakes had just multiplied. This wasn't Denver anymore. This was war against a network that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. And Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. He and Kaiser were going to drag it into the light. The operations room was dim, lit mostly by the blue glow of multiple monitors stacked in a horseshoe around the main table. Outside, the Atlanta night pressed against the windows, a heavy summer heat that clung even past midnight. Inside, it was cold enough to make Daniel's fingers stiff as he adjusted the earpiece feeding him updates from the FBI tech unit. On the largest screen, grainy surveillance footage played in a silent loop. The airport timestamp in the corner blinked with mechanical indifference. Daniel watched the sequence for the fourth time, his eyes narrowing at the casual choreography unfolding between strangers. There, near the service corridor exit, Evelyn Dawson and Mark, both wearing different clothes, in his movements that made Daniel's gut tighten. "Freeze it there," Daniel said. The tech operator paused the footage, the man's face caught mid-turn. The light from a storefront sign cast just enough shadow to make his jawline disappear into the background. Rivera leaned forward. "That's Jacob Voss." Daniel had heard the name in passing, a ghost in law enforcement circles. "The businessman?" he asked, though his tone carried no real curiosity. The word businessman in this context was almost always an insult. Rivera nodded. "Officially, yes. He owns a chain of logistics companies, a boutique travel agency, and a holding company that runs half a dozen import-export firms out of Savannah. Unofficially, we believe he's been moving people under the cover of moving goods for at least a decade. No priors, no arrests, not even a parking ticket in the last 15 years. Daniel studied the frozen image again. Voss had one of those faces you'd forget the second you looked away, too plain to be remarkable, too controlled to slip. "He's careful. Careful enough to make our jobs hell," Rivera replied. "He uses intermediaries for every transaction, every meeting, never touches the product himself. By the time we get a lead, he's 3 cities away." Daniel's gaze dropped to Kaiser, lying at his feet, eyes locked on the screen as if the dog could smell the man through pixels and glass. Maybe it's time someone got close enough that he couldn't walk away. Rivera's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's the plan. We've got 6 hours of footage from 3 different cameras. Your job is to study how he moves, how he meets people, where he positions himself. We need to anticipate his rhythm." They rolled the footage again, this time with audio from a distant parabolic mic that had caught muffled fragments of conversation. Voss's voice was low, almost soothing, no threats, no bargaining. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was arranging a hotel booking. But Daniel knew better. And as he watched Evelyn pass him a slim envelope and receive a folded piece of paper in return, he felt that cold, deliberate certainty settle into his chest. This wasn't a man who stumbled into crime. This was a man who built it like an architect. And now, Daniel thought, staring at the screen until the pixels blurred, it was his job to dismantle it, brick by brick, move by move, before another chop. Slack but ready. The dog's amber eyes swept the crowd with a calm alertness that Daniel had come to rely on more than any database search. A canine's instincts didn't care about probable cause or legal thresholds. They saw what they saw, and usually they were right. Atlanta hit Daniel the way most big cities did, like it was trying to be 2 places at once. On the surface, the station opened into a rush of motion and noise. Businessmen talking too loudly into phones, teenagers with earbuds and rolling suitcases, street vendors calling out about hot pretzels and sweet tea. But just beyond the polished main concourse, the shadows lengthened. Alleyways branched off between buildings with peeling paint and rusted security gates. A pawn shop with bars over the windows sat just a block from a luxury coffee chain with glass walls and laptop-tapping patrons inside. Daniel had seen this before, the city that sold you charm in daylight but kept its secrets locked behind steel doors at night. He and Kaiser walked the few blocks to their temporary safe house, a narrow brick building wedged between a tax prep office and a defunct bookstore. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. The bureau had converted the upstairs loft into a small, functional living space, 1 bed, 1 table, blackout curtains, and a corkboard waiting for maps and faces. Daniel dropped his duffel, unclipped Kaiser's lead, and let the dog pace the perimeter. The shepherd's nails clicked softly against the worn wood floors, head swinging side to side, tail held level, scanning, cataloging. Outside the window, Atlanta's contradictions kept playing out. Neon signs lit the street in fractured color. Down on the corner, a man in a pressed suit shook hands with another in a hoodie and jeans. They exchanged something too small for the human eye to track. In the distance, the high-rise hotels glittered like they belonged to another city entirely. Daniel leaned on the sill, memorizing the rhythm of the street. You could learn a lot from a city if you just stood still long enough. Who belonged, who didn't, which cars came around twice, which faces kept reappearing. Somewhere out there, Voss was moving between these 2 Atlantas, the one people saw and the one people avoided. Daniel knew their paths would cross soon enough. and when they did, it wouldn't be by accident. Carefully sealed in plastic were 2 items pulled from the children's recovered belongings back in Denver: a thin cotton scarf and a scuffed canvas backpack. Both had been dusted for prints and fibers. Both were now clear for Kaiser to use. Daniel crouched beside him, unsealing the first bag. "Easy, boy. Find it." The words were quiet, more ritual than command. Kaiser lowered his nose, inhaling deeply, the muscles along his shoulders rippling with focus. When he lifted his head, those amber eyes locked forward, sharp and certain. He had the trail. The search took them through the industrial belt south of the city, where the skyline gave way to long stretches of corrugated metal warehouses and chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. Semi-trailers idled in gravel lots, their diesel fumes mixing with the metallic tang of wet steel. Kaiser worked methodically, weaving along the edges of loading bays, pausing now and then to test the air. Daniel knew better than to rush him. Canine work wasn't about speed, it was about certainty. Twice, Kaiser broke from the line Daniel expected, circling back toward narrow service alleys. Each time his body language tightened, head low, tail stiff. The breakthrough came at the edge of a rail spur, where the tracks disappeared into the yawning mouth of an abandoned shipping depot. The place looked dead, boards over the windows, padlocks on the doors, weeds pushing through the asphalt. But as Kaiser pulled Daniel toward a rusted side gate, his nostrils flared, and he let out a low, resonant woof. Not an alarm bark. Recognition. Daniel unhooked the small portable recorder from his belt. "Subject indicating possible match at location, East Hollow Freight Depot," he murmured into the mic. He knelt, brushing his gloved fingers along the base of the gate. A faint smear of something dark clung to the metal, grease maybe, but fresher than it should have been for a place supposedly abandoned for years. Kaiser's nose was already there, pressing to the spot, then following the scent trail under the gate toward the shadows inside. They couldn't enter without a warrant, but Daniel's gut told him they were close. This wasn't just another waypoint in the city's endless maze of logistics. This was a holding point: rusted gutters. Perfect conditions for a stakeout. Perfect conditions for things to go wrong. The tactical team moved like shadows, each member slipping into position with practiced precision. Kevlar vests creaked softly as they crouched into their designated spots, the click of rifle safeties barely audible. Nobody spoke unless necessary. The air was already thick with unspoken focus. Daniel knelt at the side entrance, the warped metal door towering above him. The narrow alley smelled faintly of engine oil and rain-soaked concrete, a smell that clung to Kaiser's fur as the German shepherd pressed close, nose lifted slightly, testing the shifting currents of air. Through the earpiece, a voice broke the quiet. "Alpha team in position. Bravo confirm." Daniel tapped his mic once. "Bravo in position." His voice was calm, but his eyes kept moving, across the rooftop line, down the length of the fence, to the dark corners where a threat could materialize. Kaiser shifted his weight forward, ears swiveling toward the building's interior. Daniel felt the tension through the leash, that subtle, coiled energy that meant the dog was locked onto something he couldn't yet see. From the main approach, a muted metallic thud echoed, the sound of the battering ram being quietly set down, not yet used. This wasn't a rush job. Command wanted the place surrounded, sealed, every possible escape route covered before the first move was made. A bead of sweat traced down Daniel's temple, not from heat, but from the weight of the moment. He knew the depot might be more than just a drop point. It could be where the missing kids passed through, where evidence could vanish in minutes if they weren't careful. His thumb brushed over the ridged texture of Kaiser's collar. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The shepherd's only response was a slow, controlled exhale, muscles taut beneath his handler's steadying hand. The radio crackled again,
this time softer. All teams maintain positions, wait for green light. And so they waited, Daniel's heartbeat sinking with the slow rise and fall of Kaiser's breath, both of them locked in the stillness before the storm. The side entrance's shadow swallowed Daniel and Kaiser, giving them a perfect vantage point over the narrow strip of cracked asphalt between the depot and the adjacent loading dock. The glow of soda crates from an unmarked van. His voice didn't carry far, but the rhythm of it had weight. Even from this distance, Daniel could tell the orders were precise, not the casual chatter of a foreman. The men nodded without hesitation, their eyes avoiding his face as they moved to comply. Kaiser's ears pricked forward. A low, almost imperceptible rumble vibrated in his chest. Daniel followed his line of attention, not toward the workers or the van, but toward a corrugated wall section of the depot itself, where a sliding panel looked just slightly newer than the rusted metal around it. A false wall. The air shifted faintly, carrying a trace scent Daniel couldn't name, but Kaiser clearly recognized. The shepherd's body went rigid, tail low, the kind of posture that told Daniel this wasn't just suspicion, it was confirmation. "Bravo to command," Daniel whispered into his mic. "Eyes on Voss, possible concealed entry, east wall near loading bay 3. Kaiser's picking something up." Static crackled, then a terse reply. "Copy, Bravo. Maintain visual. Do not engage until green light." Voss's eyes swept the yard once more, and for a fraction of a second, Daniel felt them pass over his position, too fast to be certain, but enough to send a cold thread down his spine. The man smiled at one of the workers, but it didn't reach his eyes. Daniel kept his breathing steady, one hand resting on Kaiser's harness. Whatever was behind that false wall, it wasn't meant to be found, and he knew, in his gut, that once the storm broke, they wouldn't have long to get inside. The order came down in a clipped whisper over the comms. "Green light, execute." In an instant, the quiet hum of the stakeout transformed into precise motion. Shadows detached from the corners of the lot, agents moving in sync, boots soft on asphalt, rifles angled low. No shouting, no chaos, just the disciplined rhythm of a team that knew surprise was its greatest weapon. Daniel squeezed Kaiser's harness. "With me." They advanced along the east wall, the cool metal of the warehouse brushing Daniel's shoulder. Ahead, two agents peeled off to secure the loading bay, while another pair moved to cut off any exit toward the rear. The breach team hit the main doors, silent flash of a hydraulic spreader, hinges groaning in protest. Stiffened, ears thrust forward, eyes fixed on a shipping container wedged between two larger stacks. The padlock was new, its metal still shining under the warehouse lights. A muffled sound leaked from within, high-pitched, wavering, like breath caught between a sob and a whisper. Daniel's heart hit once, hard. "Container, east quadrant," he spoke into his mic. "Possible victims." Within seconds, two agents joined him. Bolt cutters bit through the lock with a sharp snap. Daniel eased the doors open. Inside, the dim light revealed two small shapes huddled against the far wall, a boy and a girl, eyes wide, faces pale under a film of dust. For a beat they didn't move, as if unsure whether this was another trick. Then Kaiser stepped forward, slow and deliberate, lowering his head until his nose touched the girl's hand. Something in her posture broke. A sob escaped her, and the boy clung to her side. Daniel crouched low, keeping his voice soft. "You're safe now. We've got you." The girl's small fingers curled into Kaiser's fur, holding on like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. At that moment, amid the quiet control of the operation, Daniel knew this was why they were here, not just to dismantle a network, but to make sure fear gave way to safety, one child at a time. The office at the back of the depot looked like 1,000 other rooms built to keep paper safe from dust. Metal desk, dented file cabinets, blinds half closed against the sodium glow outside. A fan clicked with a tired wobble, pushing air that smelled faintly of oil and old coffee. In a corner,
A potted plant had given up on everything but habit. It was a place designed to be overlooked, and that felt right for the man sitting behind the desk. Jacob Voss had removed his jacket and draped it over the chair back with careful neatness. His shirt sleeves were rolled once, precise as a ruler line. He sat with his hands folded, elbows off the desk, the posture of a man who'd spent a lifetime learning how to look reasonable. When Daniel stepped in, Kaiser easing at his heel, Voss lifted his eyes without any hurry at all. "Officer," he said, and the word carried no more weight than weather. "You folks have made quite an entrance." Daniel let the door. "Supplier in Macon. Perishable. Your delay is going to cost us both." "Paper's a good costume," Daniel said mildly, "but it doesn't change the shape underneath." Silence a moment. The fan clicked. Voss's gaze slid briefly to Kaiser, then back to Daniel. "You're the handler from Denver," he said, "the one who likes long looks and short questions. Sometimes that's all the work needs." Voss's eyes were the color of steel when rain is about to start. Temperate, non-committal. "Then ask." Daniel didn't reach for the folder. He let the room hold the space between them. "We found a container," he said at last. "2 kids inside, alive." The word had its own quiet gravity. It stripped the place of pretense. "They're safe down the hallway with a medic. There's a blanket around their shoulders." Someone handed them juice boxes and said their names the way names ought to be said. Voss's expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, like a boat adjusting to a new current. "I'm sorry to hear there are children mixed up in your operation," he said, and managed to wrap the sentence in civility so smooth it almost sounded like sympathy. Kaiser's ears tipped forward, the smallest movement, but Daniel felt the message of it along the line of his own breath. "Hear that?" He let it pass through him and set it down. "You were on camera," Daniel said, keeping his tone steady, "at 3 airports in 6 weeks. In each you met intermediaries who were transporting minors. You took envelopes. You handed off paper. In Denver you were a day too late. We have the tote from that run too, by the way. Sedatives, multiple passports, a phone meant to vanish." Voss leaned back, a hand loosening his tie as if the warm night had only now reached his collar. "Logistics is a messy business. People hand me things every day. Bills of lading, customs declarations, notes that say the coffee shipment is delayed in Jacksonville. If your cameras show me accepting paper, I accept your cameras. It proves nothing but that I do my job." Daniel didn't argue the point. He reached finally for the folder and slid one photograph across the desk. Evelyn outside a gate, scarf bright as a field of summer. Mark beside her, that clean, forgettable windbreaker. 2 children a step removed from the outrage. "I'm afraid I disappoint easily. I run companies that move goods. Sometimes I meet suppliers. Sometimes I shake hands. My lawyers will be here shortly. We'll sort through your misunderstandings then." There was a hardness at the center of the word misunderstandings that brushed the skin like a burr. Daniel let the silence widen around it. Out in the hall, a soft knock and the hush of a voice. The kind of noises that made a person remember there were other rooms in the world where people were careful with each other. He set the folder aside and folded his own hands. "You ever notice," he said, conversational as a porch step, "how some rooms change when a dog lies down in them?" He nodded to Kaiser. "People's breathing gets a little slower. Voices ease. Truth shows up at the doorframe because it's tired of waiting outside." Voss glanced again at Kaiser. "I prefer quantifiable evidentiary standards over canine atmospherics." "Me too," Daniel said. "Good thing we brought both." He reached for a second folder, thin, not dramatic, and slid a printed still across. It was nothing much to look at. A grainy exterior shot of the depot's east wall, a sliding panel newer than its neighbors. "That door isn't on your floor plan," he said. "There's no permit for modifications. And that padlock we cut, it was installed last week." Voss's gaze didn't so much as twitch. You could burn a city to the ground with all the code violations you'll find in old buildings. Add mine to the list. And the names? Daniel opened the final photo. It showed the inside of the container, already empty now, but with the ghosts of small hands evident in the dust. Someone had tried to wipe the place clean and hadn't had the time. 2 smudged arcs near the floor, a scuff near the hinge where a shoe had dragged. Do code violations usually carry lists of first names written in block letters? The ones we found in Denver matched the kids we took out of your container tonight. Voss's composure thinned, then smoothed, a lake settling after a stone sinks. You're building a story, he said. I respect the craft, but it isn't mine. A pause. Daniel let it stretch until he could feel the room's edges again. The fan clicked. Somewhere distant, a siren wound up and faded. He knew within 3 steps by the quiet give of air behind him. Kaiser rose smoothly and fell in at Daniel's knee, the leash a loose ribbon between them. They walked past the break room where styrofoam cups made a pale forest on the counter, past a supply closet that smelled like pine sol and dust, past a storage cage where shrink wrap gleamed like the skin of some sleeping thing. At a side door, Daniel paused. Through the narrow glass, the staging area had become a small, careful village, medics running softly, an agent kneeling to talk at a child's height, a blanket draped like a sunrise over tiny shoulders. The girl from the container had her hands in Kaiser's fur again. Another handler had brought him in when they'd first opened the doors, let him give them the kind of steadiness that can't be issued or purchased. Now that the immediate checks were done, Kaiser had returned to Daniel's side, but the memory of his presence lingered there like warmth in a chair after someone kind has stood up. Voss stood at Daniel's shoulder and watched, his face turned into the reflection on the glass, his own features layered over the scene beyond. For a long beat, neither man spoke. "They'll sleep tonight," Daniel said finally, voice no louder than the hum of the fan. "Maybe not well, maybe not long, but they'll sleep in a place where doors open from the inside." Voss's reflection did not change. "And you put that at my feet," he said, as if testing how the words fit. "I set it where it belongs," Daniel replied. "You can choose not to see it, but you don't get to move it." Kaiser shifted an inch closer to Daniel's leg, as if to plant them both more firmly where they stood. Daniel felt the press of that loyalty like a hand on his back. He let the steadiness move through him and settle in his voice. "You've built a life out of staying ordinary," he said to Voss. "That's smart. Ordinary walks past cameras. Ordinary picks up envelopes. Ordinary doesn't cause a stir." He turned from the glass and met Voss's eyes in the bland hallway light. "But ordinary is going to sit in a room with people who don't scare easy, and ordinary is going to answer questions. Tonight you don't get to be a shadow. You get to be a person who explains the names written in block letters." Voss looked at him for a long time, neither defiant. Voss was a statue. Then he nodded once, the smallest hinge turning. As they moved back down the corridor, Daniel glanced again through the glass. The girl's head had fallen to one side, heavy with the kind of exhaustion that meant safety had finally gotten its arms around her. An agent adjusted the blanket. Someone whispered something that sounded like a promise. Kaiser walked beside Daniel, silent and sure. The night felt less like a threat and more like a threshold. And Daniel understood, with the certainty that comes only after long miles, that some victories are quiet on purpose, made of open doors, steady voices, and a dog whose presence can teach a room how to breathe again. They paused outside interview room 3, that narrow hallway humming with the low utilitarian quiet of after-midnight work. On one end, a vending machine blinked its patient offerings. On the other, a red exit sign cast a soft wash over the cinder block, turning gray into something like dusk. Agent Rivera handed paperwork to the officer at the desk and nodded once, an unspoken "we're ready." Inside the room, the fluorescent light had been tuned down a notch, enough to take the sting out of the walls. Daniel stepped in first. Voss followed, the line of his shoulders untroubled, the careful neutrality of a man who'd taught 1,000 rooms to see nothing.
Kaiser entered last. The soft click of his nails, the lone punctuation in the space. No cuffs, no raised voices, just furniture and choices. The table stood centered, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other, a pitcher of water set neatly on a coaster as if hospitality might persuade the evening to behave itself. A camera kept its quiet watch from the corner, a small red dot blinking the way hearts do when they're trying not to be noticed. Voss moved toward the single chair, but Daniel didn't take the one opposite him. He stayed standing. Kaiser, reading the unspoken choreography that had always threaded between them, did something he rarely did in these rooms. He stepped forward, turned his body with deliberate care, and sat squarely between Voss and the door. He didn't glance back to ask permission. He didn't check for approval. He simply found the line that mattered, exit behind him, suspect before him, and planted himself on it like a compass needle that had finally stopped wavering, unblinking, still, present. The effect was not as if commenting on a hotel lobby's decor. Theatrics? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He set his palms on the back of the empty chair opposite and let the pause become part of the architecture. Confirmation, he said at last. We don't stage what we can allow to speak for itself. Kaiser did not stare Voss down. He didn't need to. He held a point in space and time, the kind that says, I recognize you, even if the recognition is not of a face but of a pattern. The murmur of deceit, the angles of a lie, the temperature of a room when it's trying to hide its true weather. Agent Rivera took the seat by the wall, legal pad open, pen aligned to the margin. She understood what Kaiser's placement meant, not a show of force but a smoothing of edges. Humans escalate, dogs properly trained, steady. A handler knows this the way a sailor knows the wind, by what it does to everything else. Voss folded his hands and set them on the table. If this is to be a discussion, we can begin. If it is to be theater, I'd prefer a seat with a better view. Daniel pulled the chair out and sat, not opposite Voss, but angled, to include both man and dog in his line of sight. You've spent a long time betting on forgettable rooms, he said, voice even. On exits no one notices and faces that don't trouble the memory. He, Daniel tipped his chin toward Kaiser, has never forgotten a doorway in his life. Kaiser's ears pricked a fraction at the sound of his name. Then they settled again. He was not coiled. He was not tense. He was a fixed star by a door. And if Voss had spent a lifetime mastering the art of appearing harmless, here was an equal and opposite mastery, the art of appearing inevitable. Silence drew its own borders. A hallway footstep went by and fell away. Somewhere a copier woke, yawned, and slept again. Voss poured himself water from the pitcher, the glass clinking once against the table. He didn't drink. He set it within reach and curled his hand around the bottom, as if reminding himself of simple physics, weight, gravity, the way things remain where you place them unless acted upon. A dog, he said, as if marveling at the quaintness. Your case hinges on a dog. No, Daniel replied. On people. The dog helps us hear them. He could have said, watching nothing. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that was not quite a smile. You seem very sure he's reading me, he said. Perhaps he's merely waiting for a command. Perhaps, Daniel allowed, but that isn't how he sits when a room is true. It wasn't bravado. It was a handler recognizing the small, consistent markers he'd learned across years, the way Kaiser's tail rested at half-mast, neither flag nor tuck, the position of his paws, forelegs parallel, hind legs tucked with economy, the slow blink absent from his gaze. This was not the posture for harmless error or bureaucratic tangle. This was the posture for there is more here and you know it. Rivera wrote one line on her pad, no words, just a mark to anchor the moment to the page. Mr. Voss, she said, her tone the neutral temperature of water, we'll ask again about your associates at Savannah Logistics and the 2 intermediaries you met in Seattle and Charlotte. You are not under arrest at this moment, but we need you to help us understand the chain you stand inside. Voss's eyes cut to her, then returned to Daniel, as if somewhere along the last hallway He'd decided the handler was the one to read. "You said there were children," he murmured, almost conversational. "You present the dog, the door, the tone, and expect me to complete your sentence." "I expect you to hear it," Daniel said. He thought, not for the first time, of the children wrapped in blankets down the hall, of the girl who had learned to ask for safety with one word barely breathed, of the boy who had found a continent of calm under a shepherd's ribcage and stayed there until people's voices became soft enough to trust. Those things lived in the room whether or not they were named. Kaiser's presence braided that thread through everything, what they knew, what they could prove, and what the human heart recognizes when it is finally given no place to run. Voss shifted, the smallest adjustment of spine to chair. "What is it you want from me, officer?" "The truth you keep editing," Daniel said. "The names you hand to other people to carry. The place on the map you think is safe because the paperwork calls it something else." Kaiser inhaled, a low, felt sound more than a heard one, and Voss's gaze flicked, reflexively, to the door now blocked by muscle and will and steadiness. "Easing. You think the dog will make me confess?" "I think he makes it harder to pretend." Another silence, and in it the subtle recalibration of a man who had always trusted the invisibility of the ordinary. Voss had built a life on the frictionless passage of blending in, never too loud, never too late, never the last to leave a room or the first to arrive. But here, where an animal's stillness sat like a litmus, the usual cloud cover thinned. Finally Voss leaned back, eyes tipping to the ceiling as if seeking a more forgiving light. "If I give you a name," he said, "you will claim it was the dog." Daniel didn't smile. "No, we'll claim it was you." Kaiser did not move. He did not need to. Some confirmations don't shout. They occupy the doorway until the story comes through on its own feet, willing or not. Outside, the vending machine sighed. Down the hall, someone whispered a child's name and was answered. In the room, the distance between instincts and deceit narrowed to the width of a man's breath. Voss exhaled. A beat. Another. Then, as if stepping onto a floor he was not entirely certain would hold, he began. Corridor outside interview room 3 felt longer on the way out. Daniel's steps matched the deliberate pace of the two federal marshals flanking Voss, each of them a wall of quiet competence in dark suits. The suspect's hands were cuffed now, nothing ceremonial, no showy click for the sake of it, just the matter-of-fact restraint of a man who had finally run out of places to stand. Voss didn't resist. His face was unreadable, the kind of practiced stillness Daniel had seen in people who made a career out of denying the obvious. But his eyes, those carried something else. A flicker every time they passed another badge, another uniform, another witness to the end of his long, careful game. Kaiser padded ahead, not pulling, not lagging, his ears forward as if the hallway itself might still hold something worth catching. The air smelled faintly of toner, coffee that had been left too long on a burner, and the metallic undertone of an evening that was far from over. At the far end of the corridor, Rivera was already speaking with two agents from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. On the cart beside them lay a thick accordion interrupted, a wall cracking just enough to let the cold in. He looked away quickly, but the shift had been there. Rivera joined Daniel's side as the marshals guided Voss through the secure doors. "We've got him tied to at least 5 open cases," she said quietly, eyes on the cart. 2 in Georgia, 1 in Nevada, 2 in South Carolina, and that's before we run the digital pulls. Daniel exhaled, slow. The hallway noise seemed to fade, leaving only the low murmur of paperwork being catalogued and the distant hiss of a coffee machine in the break room. "It's more than I thought we'd get tonight," he said. "Yeah," Rivera replied, "but you're thinking about what's not in those files." She wasn't wrong. For every folder here there were likely 3 that had been burned, shredded, or hidden in jurisdictions that didn't return calls. For every child's name written in a coded ledger, there were others who would never be traced on paper. That was the thing about cases like this. Victory was measured in what you could prove, but the shadow of what you couldn't was always larger. Through the glass of the sally port, Daniel watched the marshals load Voss into the back of a black transport SUV. No resistance, no last words, just the careful lowering of his head to clear the frame, the straightening of his back once inside, and then the door shutting with a sound that felt final but wasn't. Kaiser sat at Daniel's side, gaze fixed on the vehicle until it pulled away. The shepherd didn't understand warrants or federal statutes, but he understood when a threat was leaving the room for good. His posture eased, just slightly, and Daniel reached down, resting a hand on the strong curve of his neck. "You did good," he murmured, the words low enough that only the dog heard them. Rivera started organizing the chain of custody tags with one of the junior agents. "We've got teams going through the warehouse until morning," she said over her shoulder. "If there's anything left, we'll find it." Daniel nodded, but his thoughts were already past the warehouse, past the evidence. Somewhere out there were names Voss hadn't spoken, routes that hadn't been mapped, people who hadn't been brought into the light. Tonight had been a break in the chain, but not the end of it. He'd been in this work long enough to know the difference between winning a battle and ending a war. Heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the night's weight. Daniel looked down at Kaiser again. The dog's eyes were steady, unhurried, as if to say, "We've still got work to do." Rivera came back, pen tucked behind her ear. "Command wants a full debrief at 0700. Think you'll be able to get some sleep?" Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "Sleep's a tomorrow problem." They stood there a moment, two agents and a dog in a pool of tired light, watching the last of the evidence carts roll toward processing. Outside, the city carried on, unaware or maybe unwilling to know that under its lit windows and quiet streets, the net had been pulled tight on one man, while countless others still moved in the dark. It was a victory. It was not enough. And that truth was what kept Daniel's hand resting on Kaiser's shoulder as they turned toward the next thing that needed doing. The sun was sliding low over the front range, turning the sky into a slow burn of copper and rose. From Daniel Keller's back porch, Denver lay quiet in the distance, the hum of the city softened by the late summer air. The boards beneath his boots still held the day's heat, a kind of quiet warmth that settled into the bones. Kaiser lay stretched out beside him, paws extended, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Every now and then, the shepherd's ears would twitch toward some sound beyond the yard, a distant car door, a neighbor's laughter carried on the breeze, but he didn't rise. For the first time in weeks, they were off the clock. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He had been home for 3 days, but the pace of Atlanta still hummed faintly in his chest. The case had ended with custody transfers, statements, and the sharp-edged satisfaction of seeing Jacob Voss loaded into a federal vehicle. But the images, the faces of the children, the tense minutes in the warehouse, the smell of rust and dust, still came uninvited. From the yard, a light wind rattled the aspen leaves. Kaiser's head turned toward the sound, then back toward Daniel, his amber eyes catching the last light. There was no question in that look, no demand, just the quiet presence of a partner who didn't need words to understand. "They're safe now," Daniel said, not so much to Kaiser as to himself, about the net they'd closed around Voss. How much work it had taken, how much coordination, how much trust between human and dog. Trust that had started years ago in a training yard, when Kaiser was still learning the difference between hesitation and instinct. "You knew before I did," Daniel said with a faint smile. "That locked container. I might have walked past it twice." Kaiser didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped once against the porch boards. They sat like that for a long time, the air cooling, the light fading to the kind of soft gold that photographers chase. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train called out, its horn stretching over the rooftops. Daniel thought about the warehouses, the shipping manifests, the coded ledgers. The work never stopped, it just shifted shape. But tonight wasn't about chasing shadows. Tonight was about stillness, the kind that felt earned, not borrowed. He finished his coffee,
setting the mug down on the railing. The porch light hadn't come on yet, and the dim made the yard feel bigger, like the world was opening instead of closing in. Kaiser exhaled in a long, slow sigh, the kind that always made Daniel's own shoulders loosen. "You did good," Daniel said again, and this time the words carried weight. Not the quick acknowledgement from the scene, but the kind you let sit for a moment, like it might anchor something in place. In the yard, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere west. Daniel knew tomorrow the phone would ring again. Rivera with a lead, a new case file, a fresh trail to run. That was the job. But tonight, it was enough to be here, to know that for at least a few hours, the city could keep its own watch. The sky deepened to indigo. Kaiser closed his eyes, but his ears stayed half-cocked, always listening. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the last sliver of sun dip behind the ridge. After the storm, there was this, quiet, steady, and alive. It was a clear October afternoon when Daniel pulled into the narrow driveway of the Foster home. The trees along the street were burning gold and rust, their leaves fluttering down onto the hood of his truck as he cut the engine. For a moment, he sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle. Medical checkups, school placement meetings. He'd kept tabs through the case reports Rivera forwarded to him, but paper didn't tell you the truth about a child's eyes. You had to see for yourself. The front door opened before he even made it to the porch. A woman in her 40s stepped out, Janet, the foster mother. She gave him a warm, knowing smile, the kind of smile people give when they've been expecting you. "They've been asking about you all morning," she said softly. Daniel glanced over his shoulder toward the truck. "Both of us?" Janet's smile widened, especially him. The moment Kaiser jumped down from the back seat, there was movement at the doorway, two small shapes bursting forward, feet thudding against the porch boards. Lily's voice rose first, high and clear. "Kaiser!" She was faster than her brother, her sneakers barely touching the steps before she was on the gravel path, flinging herself toward the shepherd. Kaiser met her halfway, his tail sweeping in wide arcs, body dropping slightly into a bow before pushing forward into her arms. Lily buried her face into the thick fur at his neck, the giggle breaking into something wetter, softer. Ethan caught up seconds later, not as quick to throw his arms around the dog, but pressing close enough that Kaiser could lean his head against the boy's chest. Daniel stood back for a moment, watching. The last time he'd seen those arms, they had been wrapped tightly around each other, clinging like they might get pulled apart. Today they were wrapped around a dog who had once been just another uniformed shadow in their escape. "Hey, you two," Daniel said finally, his voice low but carrying. They turned toward him in unison, grins spreading across faces that had once been pinched with fear. Lily stepped forward, still keeping a hand on Kaiser's back, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "You came." "I promised," Daniel said. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and something baking. Janet led them to the living room where sunlight pooled across the rug, and a stack of board games sat in the corner. Kaiser settled on the floor between the couch and the coffee table, the perfect spot for both children to stay within arm's reach. They talked, about school, about the art project Lily had just finished, about the way Ethan had scored 2 goals in a neighborhood soccer game. The words tumbled over each other, eager and through the windows and catching in Kaiser's fur. The shepherd had relaxed completely now, eyes half closed as Ethan absently stroked the side of his neck. It was the kind of peace you couldn't fake, the kind that came from knowing deep in your bones that the danger had passed. Daniel glanced at Janet, who gave him a quiet nod. "They sleep through most nights now," she murmured. "Not all, but most. You helped with that." He didn't correct her. He knew the truth. It wasn't him. It was the dog stretched out on the rug, the one who had stood between them and the worst of the world when it mattered most. When it came time to leave, the goodbye was less about parting and more about promises. "You'll visit again?" Ethan asked, his small hand still resting on Kaiser's shoulder. "As long as you'll have me," Daniel said.
The children hugged Kaiser one last time, and he accepted it with the patience of a dog who understood the language of touch better than any human words. When Daniel opened the truck door, Kaiser climbed in without hesitation, but kept his eyes on the porch until it slipped out of view. Driving away, Daniel caught a glimpse of the folded crayon drawing in his jacket pocket. Safe now. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was enough for today. The sky over Denver was the color of cooling embers, that brief moment when day has surrendered, but night hasn't fully claimed the horizon. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, a mug of coffee steaming between his hands. Kaiser lay a few feet away on the braided rug, his massive frame stretched out but his head up, eyes tracking Daniel's every small movement. It had been 3 days since they'd returned from visiting Lily and Ethan. 3 days of quiet mornings, long walks along the Platte River, and the kind of stillness Daniel hadn't tasted in months. He'd been telling himself it was time to let his guard down, if only for a little while. Cases like theirs didn't come along every day, and after the arrest of Voss, the network's operations in the region had taken a serious hit. But deep down, he knew that quiet in their line of work was never permanent. It was just the inhale before the next step forward. The phone rang, not the cell which carried the noise of everyday life, calls from friends, the precinct, the occasional check-in from Rivera. No, this was the landline, the one only a few people had the number, but the cargo's gone. We think it's been offloaded somewhere in your sector. Daniel leaned against the counter, eyes narrowing. Any sign of people? A pause. We can't confirm, but there was a blanket in the cab, small, pink. No one's claiming it. His jaw tightened. He could feel the shift happening inside him, the way an ordinary evening could snap into sharp purpose with just a few words. He asked for the coordinates, took down the details, and promised to be there by first light. When he hung up, the silence in the kitchen felt different, not heavy, but focused. Kaiser had moved closer without Daniel noticing, sitting now in front of him, head tilted slightly as if reading his thoughts. Daniel crouched down, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "Looks like we've got another one," he murmured. Kaiser didn't move, didn't blink. His breathing was steady, his weight centered in a way that always reminded Daniel of soldiers waiting for the green light. Calm, but ready. Daniel straightened and looked out the window. The last line of sunlight was sinking behind the mountains, leaving the streets washed in that deep blue that comes before night. Somewhere out there, someone was waiting, maybe a child, maybe more than one, counting on strangers to show up and stand between them and the worst of the world. He turned back to Kaiser, who had risen now, tail still, ears forward. "We're not done yet," Daniel said, half to himself. Kaiser's gaze didn't waver, and just like that, the quiet days were over. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that stay with us, but the quiet moments, like the steady weight of a loyal head resting on your knee, or the way a dog's eyes seem to see right past your words and into your heart. German shepherds, with their unshakable devotion and keen instincts, remind us every day what it means to show up for someone without hesitation. Stories like Daniel and Kaiser's aren't just about bravery. They're about trust, understanding, and the quiet bond that grows between two souls who choose to walk beside each other. If you've ever loved a dog, you know it's not just companionship. It's a kind of wordless promise. If you'd like to deepen that connection with your own four-legged friend, there's a resource I've found helpful, full of little insights that make the time you share even richer. I'll leave it here for you to explore if it feels right.